He has no name. That is the first thing you need to understand, and it is the thing that tells you everything. There was a time, a long time ago, in the glory days of the Second Age, when Númenor still stood above the sea and the race of men was at the zenith of its power, when this being had a name. He had a family. He had a lineage. He had a title, a rank, a place in the world. He was somebody. He was a lord among the greatest civilization of men that has ever existed. A man of power and ambition and intelligence. A man who walked the courts of kings and who commanded the loyalty of thousands. He had a name, and the name meant something, and the world knew him by it. And then he put on a ring. And the name was eaten, consumed, dissolved, syllable by syllable, letter by letter, across centuries of slow diminishment, until there was nothing left, no memory, no record, no echo. The world forgot his name. He forgot his name. The being that had been a man became something else, something that had no name because names belong to the living, and the Witch King of Angmar is not alive. He is not dead. He is something between, something beyond, something that the categories of life and death do not apply to. He is a wraith, a hollow, a hunger wearing the shape of authority. Tonight I want to tell you the full story of the Witch King, the most powerful of the Nazgûl, the Lord of the Ringwraiths, the Black Captain who terrorized Middle-earth for more than 4,000 years. I want to trace the arc of his existence from the man he was to the horror he became, and I want to show you something that most people miss. The Witch King is not just Sauron's servant. He is Sauron's masterpiece. The proof of concept. The demonstration, walking and terrible, of what the Rings of Power were designed to do to the race of men. Stay with me. This story is older than most civilizations and darker than most nightmares. Part 1. The Man Before the Wraith. We do not know his name. Tolkien never tells us. He is referred to as the Witch King, the Lord of the Nazgûl, the Morgul Lord, the Black Captain, but these are titles, not names. The name is gone, and the absence is deliberate, because the absence is the point. The Rings of Power did not merely enslave the 9 mortal kings who wore them. They erased them. They consumed the men and left the wraiths, and the wraiths have no names because the men are gone. But we can reconstruct, from the fragments that Tolkien left us, something of what the Witch King was before the wraith consumed the man. He was almost certainly an Menrian, a member of the race of men who were given the island of Númenor as a reward for their faithfulness in the wars against Morgoth. The Númenóreans were not ordinary men. They were the Edain, the kindred of men who had allied with the elves in the First Age, who had fought alongside the great elf lords against the original Dark Lord. And as a reward for their loyalty, the Valar, the angelic powers who governed the world, had given them a gift, a lifespan 3 times that of ordinary men, a land of surpassing beauty and plenty, and a knowledge of craft and lore that made them the greatest civilization of the mortal world. The Witch King came from this people. He was, before his fall, a lord of the most advanced, the most powerful, the most gifted race of men in the history of the world. He was not a savage chieftain, lured by a shiny trinket. He was a man of culture, of learning, of sophistication. A man who understood power because he had been born into it, who understood ambition because he had been raised in a society that valued achievement above almost everything else. This matters because it changes how we understand his corruption. The Witch King was not tricked by a simple deception. He was seduced by a sophisticated one. And the seduction worked not because the Witch King was stupid, but because the Witch King was brilliant. Brilliant enough to see the potential of the ring, brilliant enough to understand what it offered, and not quite wise enough to see the trap hidden inside the offering. Part 2. The Giving of the Nine. The 9 rings of power were given to mortal men by Sauron, not openly, not as gifts from a dark lord to willing servants, but through deception, through the guise of friendship and shared ambition. Sauron, in his fair form of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, had helped the elven smiths of Eregion forge the rings of power. But the 9 and the 7 that went to the dwarves were tainted from the beginning, because Sauron had a hand in their making, and his purpose was woven into their substance. The 9 were given to great kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old, as the lore tells us. Men of extraordinary ability, men of ambition, men who craved power, not necessarily evil power, not at first, but the power to do, to build, to conquer, to shape the world according to their vision. The rings offered this. They offered extended life, enhanced ability, deepened perception. They offered the kind of power that ambitious men dream of, the power to transcend the limits of mortality, to extend your reach beyond the boundaries of a single human lifespan, to become more than what nature made you. And the rings delivered on their promises. That is the horrifying thing. The rings worked. The 9 kings who received them became more powerful, more long-lived, more commanding. They accumulated wealth. They built kingdoms. They commanded armies and conquered territories, and extended their influence across regions that had never bowed to their authority before. The rings were not false promises. They were real power, genuinely given, actually delivered. But the power came with a cost that the kings did not see, or saw too late, or saw and chose to ignore. The rings were connected to the One Ring, the ring that Sauron forged in secret, in the fires of Mount Doom, to control all the other rings and their bearers. The One Ring was the master key, and the 9 rings were the locks. By wearing the 9 kings were binding themselves, slowly, incrementally, irrevocably, to Sauron's will. The power they gained was real, but it was leased, not owned. And the landlord was coming. The corruption did not happen overnight. It happened across centuries, a slow fade, a gradual dimming, a process so incremental that the kings probably did not understand what was happening to them until it was far too late. Their physical forms became thinner, less substantial, less present in the material world. Their wills became more entangled with Sauron's will. Their perception of the visible world dimmed as their perception of the unseen world, the spiritual realm in which Sauron's power operated, became sharper and more consuming. They were crossing over, not from life to death, but from the visible to the invisible, from the mortal to the something else, from the world of light and substance to the world of shadow and will. The Witch King was the first to complete the crossing, or perhaps the most willing, or perhaps the most talented, the one whose natural abilities made him the best vessel for the ring's power and the most efficient conductor of Sauron's will. Whatever the reason, the Witch King became the chief of the Nazgûl, the lord of the Ringwraiths, the greatest and the most terrible of the 9 beings who had once been men and were now something that men have no word for. Part 3. What it means to become a wraith. I want to pause here, because the process of becoming a wraith, the specific mechanics of what the rings did to the 9 kings, is one of the most psychologically horrifying concepts in all of Tolkien's work, and it deserves to be understood in full. The wraithing was not a transformation in the way that, say, a werewolf transforms, a sudden, dramatic change from one state to another. It was a fading, a slow, relentless, irreversible fading, in which the physical substance of the man became thinner and thinner, less and less present in the material world, until there was nothing left, no body, no form, no visible presence. The Ringwraith is invisible. Not invisible because of a spell or a cloak, invisible because there is nothing there to see. The body is gone. The flesh has faded. The being exists entirely in the spiritual realm, the unseen world, the realm of shadow, the dimension in which Sauron's will is the dominant force. Think about what this means from the perspective of the man undergoing it. You wake up one morning and your hand is a little harder to see. You look in a mirror and your reflection is a little fainter than it was yesterday. Your body feels a little less present, a little less connected to the ground beneath your feet, a little less substantial. And this continues, day after day, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, until you are nothing. Until you are a pair of burning eyes in an empty hood, a voice without a mouth, a will without a body, a hunger that will never be satisfied because you no longer have a stomach to fill. And the worst part, the absolutely worst part, is that the process is driven by the very thing you thought was saving you. The ring that extended your life is the ring that consumed your body. The power that made you great is the power that made you nothing. The gift that elevated you above mortality is the thing that dragged you below it, into a state worse than death, because the dead are at rest, and the wraiths are not. The dead have gone wherever men go when they die, and the wraiths are stuck, trapped between the worlds, unable to live and unable to die, suspended in an eternity of hollow existence that will never end as long as the rings endure. The Witch King lived in this state for more than 4,000 years. 4,000 years of non-existence. 4,000 years of being a consciousness without a body, a will without a form. A being that can think and feel and act, but that cannot touch, cannot taste, cannot smell, cannot experience the physical world except as a distant, dimming memory of a life that ended so long ago that even the memory has faded into nothing. Part 4. The Lord of Angmar, for a long time after his wraithing, for centuries, perhaps millennia, the Witch King disappears from the record. The Nazgûl faded from the world along with their physical forms, becoming shadows, rumours, half-remembered terrors from a previous age. They were still bound to Sauron, still extensions of his will, but Sauron himself was defeated at the end of the Second Age, his ring taken, his body destroyed, his power broken. And without Sauron's active will directing them, the Nazgûl became dormant. Not dead. Not gone. Waiting, the Witch King re-emerged in the year 1300 of the Third Age, more than 1,000 years after Sauron's defeat by the Last Alliance. He appeared in the north of Middle-earth, in the frozen wastes beyond the Misty Mountains, and he founded a kingdom of his own, with its own armies, its own territories, its own political structure. He called it Angmar. This is remarkable, and it tells us something important about the Witch King that most people miss. He was not merely a puppet. He was not just a weapon that Sauron pointed at targets. The Witch King had initiative. He had strategic vision. He had the ability to operate independently, to build something from nothing, to create a functional kingdom in a hostile wilderness, and to maintain it for centuries. Angmar was not Sauron's creation. It was the Witch King's, a kingdom founded and governed by a being who had been dead for 1,000 years and who still had the ambition and the capability to carve out a domain of his own. And Angmar had a purpose. The kingdom was positioned, geographically and strategically, to threaten the northern successor kingdoms of Arnor, the remnants of the great kingdom that Elendil had founded when the Númenóreans came to Middle-earth. Arnor had fractured, after internal disputes, into 3 smaller kingdoms: Arthedain, Cardalon, and Rudor. These kingdoms were the guardians of the north, the protectors of the lands between the misty mountains and the sea. And the Witch King set about destroying them. Not in a single overwhelming assault. In a systematic, patient, centuries-long campaign of attrition, corruption, and strategic pressure that dismantled the northern kingdoms piece by piece, generation by generation, until there was nothing left. The Witch King conducted what might be the longest military campaign in the history of fantasy literature, a campaign that lasted more than 600 years, from his founding of Angmar in 1300 to the fall of Arthedain in 1974. Part 5. The Destruction of Arnor. The Witch King's campaign against the northern kingdoms is a masterclass in patient, methodical destruction, and it reveals a mind of extraordinary strategic sophistication operating behind the empty hood and the burning eyes. He started with the weakest link. Rudor, the easternmost of the three successor kingdoms, the one closest to Angmar, the one with the least defensible borders and the most fractured internal politics, was the first target. The Witch King did not invade Rudor. He corrupted it. He infiltrated its politics, supported its most ambitious and most treacherous lords, and engineered a coup that placed a puppet ruler on the throne. A hillman chieftain who owed his power to Angmar, and who served the Witch King's purposes while maintaining the fiction of independence. Rudor became, in effect, a vassal state of Angmar without a single battle being fought. The Witch King turned an enemy into an ally through political manipulation alone. And with Rudor under his control, the strategic landscape shifted. Cardolan and Arthedain were now flanked, their eastern border exposed, their former ally now a source of intelligence and military pressure directed against them. Cardolan fell next. The details are sparse in the records, but the kingdom was gradually overwhelmed, weakened by the pressure from Angmar and Rudor, diminished by wars and plagues, until it ceased to function as a political entity. The Barrow Downs, the burial mounds of Cardolan's kings and warriors, became haunted by Barrow Wights, evil spirits sent by the Witch King to infest the tombs and to desecrate the memory of the kingdom he had destroyed. Think about that detail. The Witch King did not merely conquer Cardolan. He sent spirits to inhabit the graves of its dead, to corrupt the resting places of its heroes, to turn the monuments of the fallen kingdom into traps for the unwary. This is not the work of a simple military conqueror. This is the work of a being who understands the psychological dimensions of domination, who knows that a people's identity is tied to their dead, their heroes, their sacred places, and who attacks that identity as deliberately and as systematically as he attacks their armies. And these are the same Barrow Downs where, much later, Frodo and his companions will be captured by a Barrow Wight, and will recover the ancient blades of Westerness, including the blade that Merry will carry to the Pelennor Fields, the blade that will break the Witch King's sorcerous protections and enable Owen to deliver the killing stroke. The weapon that ultimately destroys the Witch King was forged in the very kingdom he destroyed, by the very people he conquered, lying in the very graves he desecrated. The symmetry is almost too perfect to be coincidence. Tolkien understood poetic justice on a civilizational scale. Part 6. The Fall of Arthedain. With Rudor corrupted and Cardolan destroyed, only Arthedain remained, the last of the northern kingdoms, the kingdom that preserved the line of Isildur, the kingdom that maintained the heritage of the Dunedain in the north. And the Witch King turned his full attention to breaking it. The war against Arthedain lasted centuries. Generation after generation of the Dunedain fought against Angmar's armies, held the borders, defended the frontier. King after king died in battle or in the cold, exhausting attrition of a war that never ended and that could not be won, because Angmar's resources were replenished by Sauron's power, and Arthedain's were not. The Nadain were fighting a war of attrition against an enemy who did not tire, did not age, and did not die. In the year 1974 of the Third Age, Angmar launched its final assault. The capital of Arthedain, Fornost, the great fortress city of the north, was taken. The last king, Arvedui, fled to the frozen north and was lost in the ice. The kingdom of Arthedain ceased to exist. The Witch King had achieved what he set out to do. The northern kingdoms were destroyed. The line of Isildur in the north was broken, driven into exile, reduced to wandering rangers, the remnants of a once great kingdom living as homeless guardians of a land that no longer remembered them. The Dunedain of the north, who had been kings and warriors and lords of great fortresses, became the rangers of the north, grey, weather-worn wanderers, distrusted by the very people they protected, forgotten by the world they served. The Witch King did this. He took one of the great kingdoms of men and ground it into dust across 600 years of patient, relentless, methodical destruction. And the consequences of that destruction echoed across the centuries, all the way to the War of the Ring, when the absence of the Northern Kingdom meant that there was no organized military power between the Shire and the frontier of Mordor's influence, no shield for the hobbits, no guardian for the lands where the ring was hidden. The vulnerability of the Shire, the undefended, unprotected, blissfully ignorant backwater where Bilbo and Frodo lived their peaceful lives, was the Witch King's doing. He created the vacuum. He destroyed the shield. He left the north undefended, and the fact that the ring was eventually hidden in an undefended northern village was, from the Witch King's perspective, the ultimate irony. The very vulnerability he created was the vulnerability that Sauron would later try to exploit. The rangers who remained, the grey, weather-worn Nadain, who guarded the Shire without the hobbits' knowledge, were the last trace of the kingdom the Witch King had destroyed. Aragorn's own existence, his upbringing in the wild, his identity as a wandering stranger rather than a crowned king, all of this was the consequence of the Witch King's 6th century campaign. Aragorn was a ranger instead of a king, because the Witch King had destroyed the kingdom that should have been his inheritance. Every privation Aragorn endured, every year he spent in the wild, every moment he lived as a nameless exile, all of it traced back to Angmar, to the Witch King, to the patient, methodical annihilation of the northern Dunedain. This is the scale of the Witch King's impact on the history of Middle-earth. He did not merely win battles or conquer territories. He shaped the entire geopolitical landscape of the Third Age. The absence of the Northern Kingdom, the vulnerability of the Shire, the exile of the Nadain, the empty throne of Gondor. Every one of these defining features of the world that the hobbits inhabited was a consequence of the Witch King's actions. He was, in a very real sense, the architect of the world in which the War of the Ring took place, the being whose 4,000-year career of destruction created the conditions that made the war possible. Part 7. The Prophecy. After the fall of Arthedain, a relief force arrived, too late to save the kingdom, but in time to challenge the Witch King on the field of battle. An army from Gondor, led by Arnor, the son of King Ernil of Gondor, combined with elven forces from Lindon and the remnant of the northern Nadain, and they met the armies of Angmar at the Battle of Fornost. The Battle of Fornost was a decisive victory for the Allies. Angmar's armies were destroyed. The kingdom of the Witch King was broken. The Witch King himself was driven from the field, not killed, because the Witch King cannot be killed by ordinary means, but defeated, forced to flee, his kingdom shattered, his armies scattered, his centuries-long campaign ended in a single catastrophic battle. And it was at Fornost that the prophecy was spoken. Arnor, the Prince of Gondor, was fierce and proud, a warrior of great courage and greater rashness, a man who measured his worth in combat and who could not bear the humiliation of an enemy who escaped. When the Witch King fled the battlefield, Arnor rode after him, determined to chase him down, to finish him, to end the menace once and for all. But Glorfindel, the great elf lord, the warrior who had fought Balrogs in the First Age and who had been sent back from the Blessed Realm, Glorfindel stopped him. He spoke the prophecy that would echo across 1,000 years. Do not pursue him. He will not return to this land. Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of man will he fall. Not by the hand of man. The words were specific, precise, and loaded with meaning that would not become clear until the Pelennor Fields, 1,000 years later, when a woman and a hobbit, neither of them a man, would be the agents of the Witch King's destruction. Glorfindel's prophecy is one of the most important utterances in the history of Middle-earth, because it defines the terms of the Witch King's existence for the next millennium. The prophecy does not merely predict the future, it shapes it. It establishes the conditions under which the Witch King can be killed, and by establishing those conditions, it implicitly establishes the conditions under which he cannot be killed, which gave the Witch King a kind of invulnerability. Not true invulnerability. He could be hurt, he could be defeated, he could be driven from the field. But he could not be slain by any man. And in a world where armies are composed of men, where the warriors and the heroes are men, where the defenders of the free peoples are overwhelmingly male, this was, effectively, a guarantee of immortality. The Witch King could march into any battle, face any army, challenge any warrior, and know, with the absolute certainty of prophetic knowledge, that no man on the field could kill him. Think about what this does to a being. Think about what it means to fight for 1,000 years with the knowledge that you are, in every practical sense, unkillable. The Witch King was already ancient, already powerful, already terrible. The prophecy made him terrifying, because a warrior who cannot be killed is a warrior who cannot be stopped. And a warrior who cannot be stopped is a warrior who changes the calculus of every battle he enters. The presence of the Witch King on a battlefield was not merely the presence of a powerful combatant. It was the presence of an inevitable force, a being whose victory was guaranteed by the terms of prophecy, a being who could be delayed but never defeated, resisted but never overcome. And the Witch King knew it. He heard the prophecy, or learned of it, and he carried it with him for 1,000 years. A talisman of invincibility, a guarantee that no man could bring him down. The prophecy became his armor, more effective than any shield, more protective than any spell. He believed himself beyond the reach of mortal weapons. And for 1,000 years, he was right. Part 8. The Challenge to Gondor. The Witch King did not fade into obscurity after the fall of Angmar. He went south, to Mordor, to the Shadow, to the place where Sauron's power was gathering again in the darkness. And there, over the centuries that followed, he rebuilt. He gathered the other Nazgûl. He waited for Sauron's return. And he turned his attention to the south, to Gondor, the greater kingdom, the stronger enemy, the prize that Sauron wanted most. In the year 2000 of the Third Age, the Witch King led the Nazgûl in an assault on Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Moon, the beautiful Gondorian fortress on the western slopes of the Mountains of Shadow, the sister city of Minas Tirith. The siege lasted 2 years. In 2002, Minas Ithil fell. The Witch King took it and made it his own, transforming it, corrupting it, turning the Tower of the Moon into the Tower of Sorcery, the city of the Ringwraiths. Minas Ithil became Minas Morgul, and the beautiful fortress that had once shone with the light of the moon became a place of dread, glowing with a sickly pale light that was not moonlight, but something else, something cold, something that made the skin crawl and the heart race and the courage fail. The capture of Minas Ithil was strategically devastating. It gave the Witch King control of a major fortress on Gondor's eastern border, directly threatening Minas Tirith across the valley of the Anduin. It gave Sauron access to the Palantir of Minas Ithil, the Seeing Stone, the ancient communication device that would later become Sauron's primary tool for psychological warfare against Denethor. And it sent a message to Gondor: the enemy is not distant. The enemy is on your doorstep. The enemy has taken one of your cities and made it his own, and the Tower of the Moon now glows with the light of corruption. But the Witch King's most devastating blow against Gondor was not military, it was personal. Arnor, the same Gondorian prince who had ridden against the Witch King at Fornost, who had been stopped by Glorfindel's prophecy, was now the King of Gondor. And the Witch King challenged him to single combat. It was a taunt, a deliberate provocation, designed to exploit Arnor's greatest weakness, his pride. The Witch King knew that Arnor was a warrior king, a man who could not resist a personal challenge, a man whose honor was tied to his courage in combat. The challenge was not a genuine offer of combat. It was a trap, a lure, designed to draw the King of Gondor into the Witch King's power. Arnor's counselors warned him. They begged him not to go. But Arnor was proud, and the Witch King's challenge burned in his mind like a brand. And in the year 2050, Arnor rode to Minas Morgul alone to face the Witch King in single combat. He was never seen again. The king was gone. The throne was empty. No heir was proclaimed. And Gondor, the greatest kingdom of men in Middle-earth, was left without a king. Not because the king had fallen in battle, not because the king had died of illness or old age, but because the Witch King had reached into Gondor's court, plucked the king from his throne with a taunt and a dare, and consumed him in the darkness of Minas Morgul. Gondor would not have another king until Aragorn. For nearly 1,000 years, from 2050 to Thrudi 19. The kingdom would be governed by stewards, caretakers, men who ruled in the king's name because there was no king. The absence of the king was the defining political fact of Gondor's existence for an entire millennium, and it was the Witch King's doing. He broke the line of kings. He created the vacancy. He left Gondor leaderless at the moment when it most needed a leader. And the consequences of that vacancy, the slow decline, the shrinking borders, the gradual loss of power and population, shaped every event that followed, all the way to the War of the Ring. Part 9. 1,000 Years of Shadow. Between the disappearance of Arnor in 2050 and the beginning of the War of the Ring in 3018, the Witch King existed in a state of suspended menace, present in the world, lurking in Minas Morgul, but rarely visible, rarely active, rarely the subject of the stories that the peoples of Middle-earth told around their fires. 1,000 years is almost impossible to comprehend. Think of everything that has happened in the last 1,000 years of our own world, the rise and fall of empires, the transformations of civilizations, the birth and death of entire ways of life. The Witch King existed through all of the equivalent in Middle-earth. He existed through the decline of Gondor, watching the kingdom he had wounded slowly bleed out across the centuries. He existed through the fading of the elves, watching the ancient powers of Middle-earth diminish and withdraw. He existed through the quiet centuries when the Shire was founded and grew and became the peaceful, ignorant, blissfully protected backwater where the ring would eventually come to rest. The Witch King was patient. This is one of the qualities that makes him different from the other servants of Sauron, different from the orcs, who are creatures of impulse and violence, and different from the other Nazgûl, who seem to lack the independent strategic initiative that the Witch King displays. The Witch King could wait. He could endure the slow passage of centuries without losing focus, without losing purpose, without losing the cold, calculating intelligence that had destroyed Arnor and broken the line of Gondor's kings. And during those long centuries, Minas Morgul festered. The fortress that had once been beautiful became a place of corruption, a city of the dead, glowing with its sickly phosphorescent light, inhabited by spirits and shadows and the terrible, slowly accumulating malice of a being who had been nursing his hatreds for longer than most civilizations had existed. The valley of Minas Morgul became a place where no living thing would grow, where the water ran with poison, where the air itself tasted of decay. The Witch King was reshaping the land around him, imposing his nature on the physical world, turning a place of beauty into a reflection of his own corruption. This is the horror of the Witch King. He is not merely a powerful enemy. He is a corrosive presence, a being whose existence degrades everything around him, whose proximity corrupts the land, the water, the air, the spirit. He is not just dangerous to fight, he is dangerous to be near. He is a walking blight, a mobile zone of spiritual contamination. And his 1,000-year residence in Minas Morgul turned one of the most beautiful places in Gondor into one of the most horrifying places in Middle-earth. And during those centuries, the Witch King was not entirely idle. He was preparing. The military infrastructure of Minas Morgul was being built, expanded, refined. The orc breeding pits that would produce the armies of the Morgul host were established and maintained. The weapons workshops that would forge the Grond and the siege engines were constructed. The Witch King was building a war machine, slowly, patiently, with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized his campaign against Arnor. He was preparing for the war that he knew was coming, the war that Sauron was planning, the final war that would either restore Sauron's dominion or break it forever. The Witch King also maintained the 3 Nazgûl that Sauron had stationed at Dol Guldur, his secondary stronghold in southern Mirkwood. These 3 wraiths, operating under the Witch King's overall command, kept the pressure on the northern elves and maintained Sauron's presence in the upper Anduin region. The Witch King was not merely holding Minas Morgul, he was coordinating a 2-fortress posture, the Morgul Vale in the south and Dol Guldur in the north. That gave Sauron's forces the ability to threaten both Gondor and the northern kingdoms simultaneously. The patience is the quality that defines this period. 1,000 years of preparation, 1,000 years of building, forging, breeding, planning, 1,000 years of the cold, calculated, unwavering focus of a being who had already spent 2,000 years as a wraith and who had learned that time was his weapon, that the mortal kingdoms aged and weakened while he remained unchanged, that the passage of centuries was an advantage rather than a burden, that the patience of the undead could outlast the courage of the living. Part 10. The Return of Sauron. When Sauron returned to Mordor and declared himself openly, around the year 2951 of the Third Age, the Witch King became once again an active instrument of war. The dormant weapon was reactivated. The waiting servant received his orders, and the Witch King moved from the long patience of the interregnum to the focused urgency of a being with a mission. Sauron's return changed the Witch King's situation in a fundamental way. For 1,000 years, the Witch King had operated with a degree of independence. He had his kingdom, his fortress, his own sphere of influence. With Sauron's return, that independence was subsumed into the larger strategy. The Witch King was once again a subordinate, the chief subordinate the Lord of the Nazgûl, the most trusted and the most capable of Sauron's servants, but a subordinate nonetheless. His will was once again an extension of Sauron's will. His actions were, once again, directed by the intelligence and the strategic vision of the Dark Lord. And Sauron's first priority was the ring. The One Ring, the master weapon, the key to Sauron's power. The object that had been lost for 3,000 years, and that Sauron needed back with a desperation that bordered on madness. The ring had been found. Gollum had been captured and interrogated, and the words Shire and Baggins had been extracted. The ring was in the hands of a hobbit, in a place called the Shire, somewhere in the northwestern corner of Middle-earth. Sauron sent the Witch King to find it. Part 11. The Hunt. The hunt for the ring is the moment when the Witch King comes alive in the story, when the ancient, patient, calculating being who had spent centuries in his fortress emerges into the world and becomes, for the first time in the narrative of the Lord of the Rings, a character rather than a historical figure. The Witch King led the 9 riders westward. They crossed the Anduin, rode through Rohan, entered the lands west of the Misty Mountains, and began searching for the Shire and the hobbit named Baggins. And the hunt itself tells us something about the Witch King's limitations, because the hunt went badly. The Nazgûl were operating in unfamiliar territory. They had no intelligence infrastructure in the northwest of Middle-earth, no agents, no spies, no network of informants. They were searching blind, relying on the ring sense, the faint pull of the One Ring, the resonance that the Nazgûl could feel through their own rings, and on whatever information they could extract from the frightened populations they encountered. They questioned Wormtongue on the borders of Rohan and learned the general location of the Shire. They rode on, spreading terror before them, leaving a trail of fear and darkness across the green lands of Eriador. The hunt reveals the Witch King's most significant weakness. For all his power, for all his millennia of experience, he was operating in a world that had changed enormously since the last time he had been active in the Northwest. The kingdoms he had destroyed were gone. The populations he had terrorized were dead. The landscape he had known had been transformed by centuries of depopulation and regrowth. The Witch King was searching for a place he had never visited, inhabited by a people he had never encountered, in a region that had changed beyond recognition since his departure. And the ring was moving. Frodo had left the Shire before the Nazgûl arrived. The target was mobile, heading east, carried by a being so small and so magically insignificant that the ring sense could not lock onto him with precision. The Witch King could feel the ring, a distant pull, a faint vibration at the edge of his awareness. But he could not find it. Not precisely, not quickly. The hunt became a pursuit, and the pursuit was complicated by the unfamiliar terrain, the lack of intelligence, and the maddening faintness of the signal. Part 12. Weathertop. The confrontation at Weathertop is the first direct encounter between the Witch King and the Ring-bearer, and it is a moment of extraordinary significance, both for what it reveals about the Witch King's tactical thinking and for what it nearly accomplished. Amon Slell, Weathertop, was the watchtower on the hilltop, the ancient fortress of the Northern Kingdom, now a ruin. Frodo and his companions were camped there, exposed, visible, and the Nazgûl closed in. 5 of the 9 Ringwraiths, led by the Witch King himself, ascended the hill at night, approaching the camp with the slow, deliberate menace of predators who know their prey cannot escape. The confrontation was brief and devastating. Frodo, overcome by the terror of the Nazgûl's presence and by the ring's own desire to be found, put the ring on, making himself visible to the Nazgûl in the unseen world, the world of shadow and spirit where the wraiths existed. and the Witch King stabbed him. Not with a sword, with a Morgul blade, a weapon of specific and terrible purpose. The Morgul blade was not designed to kill. It was designed to convert. A shard of the blade broke off inside Frodo's shoulder and began to work its way toward his heart, and if it had reached his heart, Frodo would have become a lesser wraith, a servant of the Nazgûl, bound to Sauron's will, carrying the ring to its master without resistance. This was the Witch King's preferred method, not brute force, not an overwhelming assault, a surgical strike, a precise, calculated, almost medical intervention that would neutralize the target, preserve the cargo, and deliver the ring to Sauron without the risk and the mess of a physical confrontation. The Witch King was not trying to fight Frodo. He was trying to transform Frodo, to turn the ring-bearer from an obstacle into a delivery mechanism, to convert the enemy into a servant. The elegance of the approach is characteristic of the Witch King's strategic style. This is the same being who corrupted Rudor from within, who taunted Arnor to his destruction, who spent 6 centuries dismantling Arnor through patient, methodical pressure rather than simple overwhelming force. The Witch King does not smash through problems. He infiltrates them. He corrupts them. He finds the precise point of vulnerability and applies the precise amount of pressure needed to achieve his objective with the minimum expenditure of force. And at Weathertop, the approach very nearly worked. The Morgul blade shard was working its way toward Frodo's heart. Frodo was dying, or worse than dying, transforming, fading into the Wraith world. If Elrond had not been able to remove the shard, if Glorfindel had not arrived, if the Bruinen had not been called upon, if the entire desperate flight to Rivendell had failed at any of a dozen points, the Witch King would have succeeded. The ring would have been recovered. The War of the Ring would have been over before it began. Part 13. The defeat at the Bruinen. The flight to Rivendell and the encounter at the ford of Bruinen are important for understanding the Witch King's position in the story, because the Bruinen represents the first major failure of his hunt, and it forces a fundamental reassessment of his mission. At the ford of Bruinen, the Nazgûl were caught in the flood. The enchanted waters of the river, called upon by Elrond's power, rose in a great wave and swept the Ringwraiths away. Their horses were drowned. Their physical forms, the cloaks, the armor, the visible shapes they had assumed to interact with the material world, were disrupted. The Nazgûl were not killed. They could not be killed by water, but they were dispersed, weakened, forced to retreat to Mordor to regroup and to acquire new mounts. The failure at the Bruinen was, from the Witch King's perspective, a catastrophe. The ring was now behind the walls of Rivendell, one of the most powerful elven strongholds in Middle-earth, protected by Elrond's Ring of Power, guarded by warriors and knowledge and ancient magic. The ring was out of reach. The covert recovery mission, the surgical, stealthy precision operation that had almost succeeded at Weathertop, had failed. The ring was in the hands of the enemy, and the enemy knew what it was and what was hunting it. From this point forward, the Witch King's role shifted. He was no longer the lead agent on a covert intelligence operation. He was the commander of a military campaign, the field general of the largest army Sauron had ever assembled, preparing for the open war that would decide the fate of Middle-earth. The hunter became the general. The knife became the hammer. And the Witch King, who had spent centuries in the shadows, stepped into the light. Not the light of day, which he feared and hated, but the light of open war. The glare of burning cities and besieged fortresses, and the terrible blood-soaked arithmetic of continental conflict. Part 14. The Witch King as general. The transformation of the Witch King from intelligence operative to military commander is one of the most important shifts in the War of the Ring. because it reveals the full range of the Witch King's capabilities and the role that Sauron assigned to him in the final campaign. The Witch King was given command of the Morgul host, the main army of Mordor, the force that would deliver the decisive blow against Minas Tirith. This was not a small command. The Morgul host was enormous, tens of thousands of orcs, reinforced by Haradrim cavalry, Easterling infantry, war trolls, siege engines, and the fell beasts of the Nazgûl providing aerial support. It was the most powerful military force assembled in the Third Age, and the Witch King was given command of all of it. This tells us something about the Witch King's standing in Sauron's hierarchy. Sauron did not give command of his most important military operation to just any subordinate. He gave it to the Witch King, the being he trusted most, the being with the most military experience, the being who had personally destroyed an entire kingdom through 6 centuries of patient warfare. Sauron trusted the Witch King to execute the most critical operation of the war, and the trust was not misplaced. The Witch King's conduct of the siege of Minas Tirith was, by every conventional military measure, exemplary. The Witch King was more than a warrior. He was a commander, a strategist, a tactician, a manager of forces, a coordinator of operations. He had to marshal the orc infantry, the Haradrim cavalry, the troll units, the siege engineers, the logistics chain that kept the army fed and supplied. He had to coordinate the timing of his assault with the broader multi-front offensive that Sauron was running. The Corsair attack on the south, the Easterling assault on Dale, the Dol Guldur strikes on Lothlorien. He had to manage the Dawnless Day, the manufactured darkness that Sauron created to protect the orc armies from sunlight and to depress the morale of the defenders. He had to maintain discipline among orc units that were naturally quarrelsome and prone to infighting. And he did all of this while simultaneously functioning as the army's most powerful weapon, the terror weapon, the morale destroyer, the being whose mere presence on the battlefield could break the courage of the defenders and turn organized resistance into panicked flight. The Witch King was both the general and the ultimate weapon. He commanded the army, and he was the army's most devastating asset, and the combination of strategic competence and personal terror made him the most dangerous military commander in the history of the Third Age. Part 15. The Dawnless Day. Before the siege began, the Witch King presided over one of the most psychologically devastating operations of the war, the Dawnless Day, the great darkness that covered the sky over Gondor, blotting out the sun, plunging the land into premature night, and creating the conditions for the Morgul host's march on Minas Tirith. The darkness came from Mordor, a vast cloud of shadow and ash and volcanic fume, sent forth by Sauron's power to cover the sky over the western lands. It was not natural darkness. It was thick, heavy, oppressive. A darkness that weighed on the spirit as well as the eyes, that pressed down on the defenders like a physical force, that communicated, without words, the message that Mordor was coming and that nothing could stop it. The Witch King marched under this darkness. The Morgul host left Minas Morgul and crossed the river Anduin and advanced across the Pelennor Fields under a sky that was not sky but shadow. A canopy of darkness that protected the orcs from the sunlight that weakened them, and that announced, with the eloquence of pure terror, the arrival of the army that would end Gondor. The psychological impact was enormous. The people of Minas Tirith looked east and saw the darkness advancing, a wall of shadow, consuming the horizon, swallowing the daylight, turning morning into midnight. And behind the darkness, barely visible, the fires of the Morgul host, the torches, the engines, the red glow of the army's campfires, thousands upon thousands of them, stretching across the Pelennor Fields like a carpet of embers. The dawnless day was the Witch King's opening statement. Before a single arrow was fired, before a single orc reached the walls, the siege of Minas Tirith had already begun. Because the siege was not merely a military operation. It was a campaign of terror. And the Witch King, who had spent 4,000 years perfecting the art of terror, knew exactly what he was doing. Part 16. The Crossing of the Pelennor. The Morgul host's advance across the Pelennor Fields is one of the most impressive military operations depicted in The Lord of the Rings, and understanding its execution gives us a fuller picture of the Witch King's capabilities as a field commander. The outer defences of Minas Tirith, the Ramus Echor, the great wall that encircled the Pelennor Fields, fell quickly. The garrison was too thin, spread across too great a perimeter, and the Morgul host's numerical superiority was overwhelming. The Witch King did not waste time on a prolonged assault of the outer wall. He breached it, poured his forces through, and advanced on the city itself, moving quickly, exploiting the momentum of the initial breakthrough, maintaining the pressure that prevented the defenders from regrouping. Once on the Pelennor, the Witch King established a siege perimeter around Minas Tirith. He deployed his forces with the methodical precision of an experienced commander, orc infantry in the van, Haradrim cavalry on the flanks, siege engines positioned at optimal range, troll units held in reserve for specific assault objectives. He dug trenches, established camps, positioned his artillery. He conducted the siege by the book that he had been writing for 4,000 years. The accumulated knowledge of a being who had been conducting military operations since before most of the civilizations of Middle-earth had been founded. The catapults launched their projectiles over the walls, and the projectiles included the heads of the Gondorian soldiers who had been killed in the fighting at Osgiliath and at the outer wall. The defenders of Minas Tirith looked up and saw the faces of their comrades arcing through the air, landing in the streets, rolling across the flagstones. The heads were a weapon, a psychological weapon, designed to break morale, to personalize the violence, to tell every defender in the city that this is what awaits you. This cruelty was calculated. The Witch King was not cruel for sport, or at least not only for sport. He was cruel as strategy. He understood that the defender's courage was a resource, a finite resource, a depletable resource, and he attacked it with the same systematic determination that he attacked the walls. Every head launched over the wall, every Nazgûl shriek from overhead, every moment of manufactured darkness was an assault on the courage of the garrison, designed to erode the defender's will to fight, designed to create the conditions for a psychological collapse that would open the city as effectively as any battering ram. Part 17. The Breaking of the Gate. The breaking of the Great Gate of Minas Tirith is the Witch King's greatest military achievement, the moment when the Lord of the Nazgûl, leading from the front, personally shattered the defense that had held against every assault for 1,000 years. The Grond, the great battering ram, named after Morgoth's hammer, was brought forward. It was a massive weapon, forged in the armories of Mordor, borne by trolls, attended by orc handlers, protected by the Nazgûl flying overhead. The ram struck the gate once, twice, 3 times, and on each stroke the Witch King spoke words of power, ancient sorceries, incantations in the Black Speech, words that carried the force of millennia of accumulated dark knowledge, and that attacked the gate not just physically, but spiritually, undermining the enchantments that protected it, eroding the ancient craft that had made it strong. The gate broke. The iron hinges shattered. The great doors, which had stood since the founding of the city, which had never been breached by any enemy, fell inward, and the Witch King rode through. This is one of the most terrifying moments in all of Tolkien. The Witch King, mounted on his fell beast, rode through the shattered gate of Minas Tirith, into the city, into the first level, into the heart of Gondor's capital. No living man dared face him. The defenders fled. The streets emptied. The soldiers who had held the walls and fought the siege and endured the darkness and the screaming and the heads of their comrades falling from the sky, these men, these brave, exhausted, terrified men, broke and ran when the Witch King rode through the gate. And why would they not? The Witch King was 4,000 years old. He radiated terror the way a furnace radiates heat, not as an emotion but as a physical force, an aura of dread that attacked the nervous system directly, bypassing the rational mind, striking at the primal animal core of every living being in his proximity. The soldiers did not run because they were cowards. They ran because their bodies overrode their minds, because the terror of the Witch King was beyond the capacity of mortal courage to withstand, because the thing that had ridden through the gate was not a warrior they could fight, but a force of nature they could only flee. The Witch King was inside Minas Tirith. The city's defences were breached. The army was pouring through the shattered gate. The siege was over. The city was falling. And then Gandalf appeared. Part 18. The confrontation with Gandalf. The confrontation between the Witch King and Gandalf at the Broken Gate is one of the great might-have-been moments of The Lord of the Rings, a moment when two extraordinary powers faced each other across a pile of rubble and shattered iron, and the outcome was left forever unresolved. Gandalf stood alone. On Shadowfax, the great horse, white and gleaming in the darkness, Gandalf blocked the Witch King's path, the only being in Minas Tirith with the power and the will to face the Lord of the Nazgûl and not break. Every other defender had fled. Every soldier, every knight, every lord of Gondor had retreated from the thing that rode through the gate. Only Gandalf remained. And the Witch King laughed. The laughter is described in the text, and it is chilling. The laughter of a being who has been challenged by the one person who might be his equal, and who relishes the confrontation. The Witch King raised his sword and the blade burst into flame. He drew himself up, growing in stature and menace, becoming taller, darker, more terrible. He was, in that moment, at the height of his power, the Lord of the Nazgûl, the conqueror of kingdoms, the breaker of gates, standing in the breach of the greatest city in Middle-earth, facing the only being who might stop him. "Old fool," the Witch King said. "This is my hour. Do you not know death when you see it?" The confrontation was never resolved. Before the two could clash, the horns of Rohan sounded. The Rohirrim had arrived on the Pelennor, and the battle shifted from the gate to the fields. The Witch King turned away from Gandalf, turned toward the new threat, and rode out to meet the cavalry charge that would decide the battle. What would have happened if they had fought? Tolkien never tells us. He leaves the question hanging, a deliberate ambiguity, a moment of unresolved tension that scholars and fans have debated for decades. Could Gandalf have defeated the Witch King? Could the Witch King have overcome Gandalf the White? The text gives us no answer. It gives us only the confrontation, the challenge, the moment of suspended violence, and then the horns, and the turn and the departure. I think the ambiguity is the point. The confrontation at the gate is not about who would have won. It is about the fact that only Gandalf, a Maya, an angelic spirit, a being of the same order as Sauron himself, could stand where every mortal man had broken. The Witch King's terror was absolute over mortal beings. Gandalf was not mortal, and the confrontation at the gate establishes, with the precision of a mathematical proof, the exact level of the Witch King's power, greater than any man, greater than any warrior of Gondor or Rohan, but not greater than the Astari. The Witch King was the most powerful being on the battlefield, but the battlefield contained a being who was not of the battlefield, a being who existed on a higher plane, and against that being, the Witch King's supremacy was not certain. Part 19. The Charge of the Rohirrim. When the horns of Rohan sounded and 6,000 cavalry swept onto the Pelennor Fields at dawn, the Witch King faced his most significant tactical challenge since the Battle of Fornost. The Rohirrim were a devastating military force, heavy cavalry, charging at full gallop, crashing into the orc formations with the weight and the velocity of an armoured avalanche. The charge broke the siege. It shattered the orc lines that were pressing toward the shattered gate. It threw the Morgul host into confusion and turned a moment of triumph into a moment of crisis. The Witch King adapted. He redeployed his forces, redirected the Haradrim cavalry to meet the Rohirric charge, and flew above the battlefield on his fell beast, using the terror of the Nazgûl to disrupt the charging horsemen, to break their formation, to create confusion and fear in the ranks of the cavalry. He was doing what he did best, projecting terror as a tactical weapon, using his supernatural dread to degrade the enemy's fighting capability. And the Witch King targeted the enemy commander. Thodin, king of Rohan, leader of the charge, the old king who had ridden to war despite his age and his weariness, because his allies were in danger and his honour demanded it, Thodin was the Witch King's target. If the king fell, the charge would falter. If the charge faltered, the siege could be restored. If the siege was restored, the city would fall. The Witch King attacked Thodin. The fell beast struck Thodin's horse Snowmane, and horse and rider went down. Thodin was trapped beneath his fallen horse, crushed, dying. The king of Rohan, who had ridden to the salvation of Gondor, was brought down by the Witch King's personal attack, a targeted strike aimed at the enemy's leadership, designed to decapitate the cavalry charge at the moment of its greatest impact. And the Witch King believed he had won. The king was down. The charge was disrupted. The gate was broken. The city was falling. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The Witch King was the master of the Pelennor, the conqueror of Minas Tirith, the general whose campaign had achieved every objective. The siege had broken the city. The charge had been met. The king was dead or dying. Victory was minutes away. But a woman and a hobbit stood over the body of the king, and the prophecy of Glorfindel was about to come due. Part 20. Owen. Owen is the answer to the question that Glorfindel's prophecy asked 1,000 years earlier. Not by the hand of man will he fall. And here was the answer. A woman. A shield maiden of Rohan. A being who was not a man, and who did not know that she was the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy, and who did not care. Owen had ridden to the Pelennor in disguise, concealed among the riders of Rohan, hidden behind the helm and the armour of a warrior, carrying the name Dernhelm and the secret of her presence. She had been forbidden to ride to war. She had been told to stay behind, to guard the people, to wait. And she had refused, not out of disobedience, but out of a despair so deep and so consuming that she preferred death in battle to the suffocating hopelessness of a life without purpose or honour. Owen's despair is essential to understanding her confrontation with the Witch King, because it is the despair, paradoxically, that makes her dangerous. The Witch King's primary weapon is fear. His terror breaks the will of mortal beings, sends soldiers fleeing, paralyzes the bravest warriors. But terror works by threatening something you value, your life, your safety, your future. And Owen had nothing left to lose. She did not value her life. She did not fear death. She had come to the Pelennor to die, and the Witch King's terror, which would have shattered a warrior who wanted to live, had nothing to grip in a woman who wanted to die. This is the hidden logic of the prophecy. Not by the hand of man, but why not? Because no man could face the Witch King without being broken by his terror. The prophecy was not a statement about gender. It was a statement about psychology. The being who would destroy the Witch King would need to be immune to his primary weapon, immune to the terror of death. And Owen, in her despair, in her absolute indifference to her own survival, was the one being on the Pelennor Fields who was genuinely immune. The Witch King confronted Owen over Thodun's body. He told her to stand aside. He radiated his terror, the full, focused 4,000-year-old malice of the Lord of the Nazgûl, directed at a single target, a woman standing alone over the body of her king. And Owen did not break. She did not flee. She did not flinch. "Begone, foul Dwymelake, Lord of Carrion." She cried, "Leave the dead in peace." The Witch King laughed again, the same terrible laughter, the same contemptuous amusement. "Hinder me?" he said. "Thou fool, no living man may hinder me." And Owen removed her helm. And the Witch King saw for the first time that the warrior before him was not a man. The golden hair spilled down. The face was revealed, the face of a woman, pale and fierce, eyes burning with the cold fire of someone who has nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. "But no living man am I," Owen said. "You look upon a woman. Owen I am, Omun's daughter. You stand between me and my lord and kin. Begone, if you be not deathless. For living or dark undead, I will smite you, if you touch him." Part 21. The Killing Stroke. Merry's role in the Witch King's death is the part that most people underestimate, and it is, I think, the most lore-significant element of the entire encounter. Merry was there. The hobbit, the small, frightened, desperately brave halfling, who had ridden to the Pelennor behind Owen, clinging to her saddle, invisible in his smallness, was there, crouching near Thodun's body, watching the confrontation between Owen and the Witch King with the terrified fascination of a being who was way out of his depth and who knew it. And Merry struck. When the Witch King raised his mace to strike Owen, when the Lord of the Nazgûl brought his weapon down to crush the woman who had dared to face him, Merry stabbed the Witch King from behind, driving his barrow blade into the back of the Witch King's knee. The blade was a weapon of Westerness, forged in the ancient kingdom of Cardolan, one of the very kingdoms that the Witch King had destroyed. It was made with enchantments specifically designed for the wars against Angmar, crafted by the Denadane smiths who had been fighting the Witch King for generations. The blade was, in a very real sense, designed to hurt the Witch King, designed for this specific enemy, crafted with the knowledge and the hatred of a people who had been fighting and losing against Angmar for centuries. Merry's stroke did something that no ordinary weapon could do. It broke the spell that bound the Witch King's physical form, the sorcery that held his invisible, immaterial body together, that gave coherence to the Wraith's presence in the material world. The barrow blade disrupted the magic. It broke the enchantment. It created a vulnerability where none had existed before. And into that vulnerability, Owen drove her sword. Between the crown and the mantle, into the empty space where the Witch King's face would have been if he had still had a face. Owen thrust her blade, and the Witch King screamed. The scream is described as a sound that no one who heard it ever forgot, a sound of such anguish, such rage, such overwhelming horror, that it transcended mere noise and became something existential, a vibration in the fabric of the world itself. The Witch King was dying, or rather, the Witch King was being unmade, the sorcery that sustained him unraveling, the bonds that held his spirit to the material world snapping like ropes under strain. The cloak collapsed. The armor fell to the ground, empty, The crown rolled across the trampled grass of the Pelennor. And the Witch King, the being who had lived for 4,000 years, who had destroyed kingdoms and broken kings, who had terrorized generations and endured centuries and fought more battles than any other being in the history of Middle-earth, was gone. Not dead in the way that men die. Dissolved, unmade, the spirit dispersed, the bonds broken, the wraith released from the material world and sent. Where? Tolkien does not say. Into the void, perhaps. Into the nothing that awaits beings who have been so thoroughly consumed by evil that there is nothing left to preserve. Part 22. The prophecy fulfilled. The death of the Witch King is the fulfillment of Glorfindel's prophecy in a way that is more precise, more layered, and more thematically rich than most readers appreciate on first reading. Not by the hand of man will he fall. The prophecy was specific, and its fulfillment was specific. The Witch King fell to a woman and a hobbit, not a man. Two beings who were, in the terms of the prophecy, explicitly excluded from the category of man, a female human and a halfling, neither of whom would have been counted among the men who fought the battles and defended the kingdoms of Middle-earth. But the prophecy worked on multiple levels. The obvious level is the literal one: no male human could kill the Witch King. But there is a deeper level, a thematic level that connects the prophecy to the larger structure of the story. The Witch King was destroyed by two beings who were, by every conventional measure of power, insignificant. Owen was a woman in a culture that did not allow women to ride to war. She had to disguise herself, to hide, to break the rules of her society in order to be present on the battlefield at all. Merry was a hobbit, a 3.5-foot tall creature from a rural backwater, with no military training, no magical power, no special abilities beyond a sturdy heart and a sharp blade. These two beings, the excluded and the overlooked, the forbidden warrior and the accidental soldier, destroyed the most powerful servant of the Dark Lord. And they did it because the world's categories did not apply to them. The Witch King had built his power within the world's categories, within the framework of kings and warriors and armies and empires. He understood that framework. He had mastered it. He had spent 4,000 years operating within it, and within it, he was supreme. But Owen and Merry were outside the framework. Owen was outside because her culture had excluded her. Merry was outside because his nature was beneath the notice of the powers that shaped the world. And their outsider status, the very quality that made them marginal, that made them overlooked, that made them insignificant, was the quality that made them lethal. This is the same pattern that runs through the entire Lord of the Rings, the small and the overlooked defeating the great and the powerful. Hobbits carrying the ring to Mount Doom, a gardener climbing a mountain, a woman killing a Ringwraith. The pattern is consistent, and the Witch King's death is the most dramatic expression of it, the moment when the theme becomes action, when the philosophy becomes a sword stroke, when the idea that the small can overcome the great is demonstrated on the body of the greatest servant of evil in Middle-earth. Part 23. The Barrow Blade and the Circle of Vengeance. Let me trace the blade. Let me follow Merry's weapon from its forging to its striking. Because the journey of the Barrow Blade is one of the most extraordinary chains of cause and consequence in the entire legendarium. The blade was forged in the kingdom of Cardolan, one of the 3 successor kingdoms of Arnor, the kingdom that the Witch King destroyed in his 6th century campaign against the north. The smiths of Cardolan forged the blade with specific enchantments, designed for a specific purpose, to harm the servants of Angmar, to hurt the beings that were destroying their kingdom, to give their warriors a weapon that could cut through the sorceries that protected the Witch King and his forces. The blade failed. Cardolan fell. The smiths who made it died. The warriors who wielded it were killed. The kingdom that forged it was wiped from the map. And the blade was buried with its dead, interred in the Barrow Downs, in the tombs of Cardolan's fallen lords, alongside the bones of the men who had carried it and the memories of the kingdom it was supposed to save. And then the Witch King sent the Barrow Wights. The evil spirits, deployed by the Witch King to haunt the graves of the kingdom he had destroyed, infested the tombs, turning the Barrow Downs into a place of terror, a trap for the unwary, a haunted landscape where the dead did not rest in peace. The very weapon that had been designed to destroy the Witch King was now guarded by the Witch King's own servants, buried in a tomb that the Witch King's own malice had made impassable. But Tom Bombadil rescued the hobbits from the Barrow Wight, and when the hobbits emerged from the Barrow, they carried the blades, the ancient weapons of Cardolan, the enchanted swords that had been forged to fight the Witch King, that had been buried for centuries, that had been guarded unnamenyo by the Witch King's own servants. The blade that Merry carried to the Pelennor, the blade that broke the Witch King's sorcery, was forged by the Witch King's victims, buried by the Witch King's enemies, guarded by the Witch King's servants, recovered by the Witch King's prey, and wielded against the Witch King by a hobbit who should never have been on the battlefield at all. The circle of vengeance took more than 2,000 years to close. But it closed perfectly. The Witch King was brought down by a weapon forged by the people he had destroyed, carried by a being he had dismissed as insignificant, wielded in a moment that his prophecy protected arrogance told him could never arrive. The blade of Cardolan struck home. The kingdom's vengeance was delivered, and the Witch King, the destroyer of kingdoms, the breaker of kings, was destroyed by the last echo of his own destruction. Part 24. What was lost when the Witch King fell? The death of the Witch King was, for Sauron, a strategic catastrophe, and understanding what Sauron lost when the Witch King fell helps us appreciate the full significance of the event. The Witch King was not replaceable. The remaining Nazgûl were powerful. They were wraiths. They were terrifying. They were extensions of Sauron's will. But none of them had the Witch King's independent capability. None of them had his strategic vision. None of them had his millennia of experience in conducting military operations. The Witch King was the one Nazgûl who could function as an independent commander, who could make tactical decisions on the battlefield without waiting for Sauron's direct guidance, who could adapt to changing circumstances and respond to unexpected developments with the judgment of a seasoned strategist. Without the Witch King, Sauron lost his field command structure. The army of Mordor could still fight, the orcs could still kill, the Haradrim could still charge, the trolls could still crush, but the army could no longer be commanded with the same sophistication and adaptability. The remaining Nazgûl were terror weapons, not generals. They could frighten an army, but they could not direct one, and the quality of Sauron's tactical performance in the latter phase of the war, the fighting at the Black Gate, the final engagements, reflects this loss. The operations became simpler, cruder, more dependent on brute force, and less on the strategic finesse that the Witch King had provided. The Witch King's death also broke the psychological spell that the Nazgûl cast over the Free Peoples. For 1,000 years, the Witch King had been invincible, the being that no man could kill, the terror that could not be stopped, the force that broke every army it faced. His death at the hands of a woman and a hobbit shattered that myth. The unkillable had been killed. The unstoppable had been stopped. The terror that had paralyzed generations of warriors was, at last, just a cloak on the ground and a crown rolling in the grass. The symbolic impact is as important as the military impact. The death of the Witch King told the Free Peoples that the Dark Lord's servants were not invincible, that the forces of evil could be defeated, that the terrors of Mordor could be overcome, that the darkness was not absolute. In a war where morale was as important as military strength, the death of the Witch King was a turning point. The moment when the hopelessness that Sauron had carefully cultivated began to crack, and the defenders of the free world began to believe that victory might be possible. Part 25. Owen's Wound. There is a cost to killing a Ringwraith, and the cost falls on the killer. Owen paid that cost, and the price she paid tells us something important about the nature of the Witch King's power and the depth of the evil that he embodied. When Owen struck the killing blow, driving her sword between the crown and the mantle, the Witch King's destruction sent a shockwave through her body. Her shield arm was shattered. She collapsed on the field, unconscious, cold, barely alive. The healers who found her could not wake her. She was caught in the black shadow, the spiritual affliction that the Nazgûl's touch inflicted on mortal beings, a coldness that seeped into the soul and that no ordinary medicine could cure. Owen nearly died. Not from a physical wound, her body was battered but not fatally injured. She nearly died from the spiritual contamination of having come into direct contact with the Witch King's essence, the concentrated evil that had been accumulating in the Lord of the Nazgûl for 4,000 years. The darkness that had consumed a man and turned him into a wraith, all of it released in a single, devastating burst when the sorcery that bound him was broken. Athelas, Kingsfoil, the healing herb of the Denedane, was what saved her. Aragorn, using the healing arts of the ancient kings, called her back from the shadow. And the healing was not merely physical. It was spiritual, a reaching into the darkness that Owen had fallen into, a calling of her name, a pulling of her spirit back from the edge of the void where the Witch King's malice had dragged her. The Witch King's last act, his final unwilling gift to the world, was the wound he inflicted on his killer. Even in death, even in dissolution, the Witch King was dangerous. His corruption lingered, his touch poisoned. The woman who destroyed him was nearly destroyed by the act of destruction. And the fact that she survived, the fact that Aragorn's healing arts were enough to draw her back, is as much a testament to the power of the king's healing as it is to the depth of the Witch King's malice. The Witch King was so thoroughly steeped in evil that killing him was itself an act of almost suicidal courage, because the evil did not simply vanish when the wraith was unmade. It spilled out like poison from a shattered vessel, and anyone within reach was contaminated. Part 26. The Black Breath. Owen was not the only one wounded by the Witch King's proximity. Merry too was struck. His sword arm went numb, his body went cold, and he fell into the same black shadow that claimed Owen. And this detail reveals something about the nature of the Witch King's corruptive aura that goes beyond the individual encounter on the Pelennor Fields. The Black Breath, the spiritual affliction that the Nazgûl inflicted on those who came too close, was not an injury in the conventional sense. It was a contamination, a spiritual infection, a transmission of the wraith's own hollowness into the body and soul of the victim, as if the Witch King's emptiness was contagious, as if proximity to the void at the center of the wraith's being created a sympathetic void in the hearts of those who ventured too near. The Black Breath had been documented long before the Pelennor. Throughout the War of the Ring, those who encountered the Nazgûl, even from a distance, even without direct physical contact, reported the symptoms: a terrible cold, a feeling of overwhelming despair, a sense of life draining away, a darkness closing in from the edges of perception. Frodo felt it on the road when the Black Riders passed near. The people of Minas Tirith felt it when the Nazgûl flew overhead. The affliction was cumulative, The longer and the closer the exposure, the deeper the damage. In the houses of healing, after the battle, the healers of Gondor could not cure the Black Breath with ordinary medicine. Herbs and poultices and the conventional treatments of the healing art were useless against an affliction that was spiritual rather than physical. The patients, Owen, Merry, Faramir, who had been struck by the Black Breath during the retreat from Osgiliath, lay cold and unresponsive, slipping further into the shadow, dying not from wounds but from proximity to evil. Only Aragorn could heal them. The hands of the king are the hands of a healer, the ancient law, remembered by the Herbmaster of Minas Tirith, spoken as a proverb, proven in the houses of healing when Aragorn used Athalas and the authority of the Dunedain to call the afflicted back from the shadow. Aragorn's healing of the Black Breath was not merely medical. It was the direct opposition of the king's spiritual authority to the wraith's spiritual corruption, the contest between the power of life and the power of undeath. The warmth of the healer reaching into the cold that the Witch King's presence had created and dispelling it through the sheer force of legitimate, life-giving authority. The fact that Aragorn's arrival in the houses of healing and his healing of the Black Breath was the event that finally convinced the people of Minas Tirith that the king had returned tells us something about the Witch King's role in the larger story. The Witch King's wound was the wound that required the king's healing. The Witch King's corruption was the darkness that the king's authority was needed to dispel. The Witch King, in his destruction and in the suffering he caused, became the unwitting instrument of Aragorn's revelation, the proof that the king had returned, demonstrated through the king's ability to heal the wounds that no one else could heal. The Witch King's malice, even in death, served a purpose he would have despised. It revealed the king he had spent millennia trying to prevent. Part 27. The Witch King and the other Nazgûl. The Witch King was first among equals, but the equality was theoretical, not practical. He was the lord of the Nazgûl, and the gap between his capabilities and those of the other 8 was enormous. Understanding that gap helps us appreciate what made the Witch King unique among the 9 men who were consumed by Sauron's rings. The other Nazgûl were powerful. They were terrifying. They could fly on fell beasts, project dread, sense the One Ring, and function as Sauron's agents across continental distances. But they were, in a sense that matters, instruments rather than agents. They operated best when Sauron's will was directing them. They functioned as extensions of his consciousness, amplifiers of his power, projectors of his terror. Without his active direction, they became less focused, less coordinated, more prone to the aimless malice that was their default state. The Witch King was different. He retained initiative. He retained strategic intelligence. He retained the ability to plan, to adapt, to make decisions in the absence of direct guidance from Sauron. His 6th century campaign against Arnor was not Sauron's campaign, it was the Witch King's. His kingdom of Angmar was the Witch King's creation. His capture of Minas Ithil, his taunting of Arnor, his management of the siege of Minas Tirith, all of these demonstrated a being who could think and act with a degree of autonomy that the other Nazgûl did not possess. Why was the Witch King different? Tolkien does not tell us explicitly, but the implication is that it had to do with the man he had been before the wraithing. The 9 kings who received the rings were great kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old, but they were not equal. Some were greater than others. Some were more powerful, more ambitious, more talented. The Witch King was the greatest of them, the most powerful, the most capable, the one whose native abilities made him the best vessel for the ring's power and the most effective agent of Sauron's will. And there is another possibility, a darker one. The Witch King may have been the most willing. The corruption process required a degree of collaboration from the victim. The ring seduced, but the wearer chose to wear. The ring offered power, but the wearer chose to accept. The Witch King may have been the one who embraced the ring most fully, who surrendered to the corruption most completely, who leaned into the transformation rather than resisting it, and who, as a result, retained more of his coherence and capability than the others, because he had not wasted his strength in futile resistance. This is a chilling thought, that the Witch King's power comes not from fighting the corruption, but from embracing it. That his strength as a wraith is the reward for his willingness as a man. That the most terrible of the Nazgûl is the most terrible precisely because he chose his fate more fully than any of the others. Part 28. The Witch King's Sorcery. The Witch King was not merely a warrior and a general. He was a sorcerer, a practitioner of dark arts whose magical capabilities were as formidable as his military ones. And his sorcery tells us something about the specific nature of his power and the tools he used to achieve his objectives. The title itself, Witch King, is a designation that specifically identifies him as a practitioner of witchcraft or sorcery. Not just a king who happened to be a wraith, but a king whose identity was defined by his mastery of the dark arts. The peoples of the north who suffered under his rule in Angmar did not call him the Wraith King or the Shadow King. They called him the Witch King because his most distinctive characteristic, in their experience, was his sorcery. What kind of sorcery? The evidence is scattered across the text, but it paints a picture of a being with a specific and devastating set of capabilities. The Witch King could project terror, not as a byproduct of his nature, but as a directed weapon, focused and intensified at will. He could speak words of power, incantations in the black speech that carried the force of Sauron's authority and that could break enchantments, shatter gates, and undermine the defensive magic of his enemies. He could animate the dead. The barrow wights that he sent to infest the tombs of Cardolan were spirits under his control, deployed by his will, and maintained by his sorcery. He could also craft weapons of specific and terrible purpose. The Morgul blade that he used at Weathertop was not an ordinary weapon. It was a sorcerous instrument, a blade designed to convert rather than kill, forged with enchantments that allowed a shard to break off inside the victim and work its way toward the heart, transforming the victim into a wraith. This is not simple metallurgy. This is magical craftsmanship of a high order, the creation of a weapon that operates on the spiritual plane as well as the physical, that attacks the soul as well as the body, that transforms the nature of the victim rather than simply ending their life. The Morgul blade also had a secondary property. It dissolved after use. The blade disintegrated in the sunlight, leaving only the shard inside the victim. This is a feature, not a flaw. The dissolution ensured that the weapon could not be studied, could not be reverse-engineered, could not be used as evidence or as a basis for developing countermeasures. The Witch King designed a weapon that destroyed itself after deployment, eliminating the evidence and preserving the secrecy of its construction. This is the thinking of a sorcerer who understands operational security as well as magical theory. The Witch King's sorcery also included the manipulation of the Morgul Vale, the valley around Minas Morgul, which he transformed over centuries into a landscape of spiritual corruption. The flowers that grew in the valley were described as pale, beautiful, and sickening, living things warped by the Witch King's presence into something that was nominally alive, but spiritually dead. Beautiful in form, but nauseating in essence. The water of the Morgul stream ran with a phosphorescent glow that was described as a corpse light, the light of decay, the luminescence of corruption. The Witch King had imposed his nature on the physical landscape, turning a natural valley into a reflection of his own spiritual state, beautiful once, corrupted now, glowing with a light that was not life, but its mockery. Part 29. The Witch King and Sauron. The relationship between the Witch King and Sauron is one of the most complex master-servant dynamics in Tolkien's work, and understanding it helps us understand both beings more fully. The Witch King was bound to Sauron through the Nine Rings. His will was, in a fundamental sense, an extension of Sauron's will. He served Sauron not because he chose to, but because the ring had consumed his capacity for independent choice, had overwritten his original personality with the imperatives of Sauron's domination. The Witch King was a slave, the most powerful slave in Middle-earth, the most capable and the most trusted, but a slave nonetheless. And yet the Witch King was more than a slave. His independent activities, the founding of Angmar, the centuries-long campaign against Arnor, the taunting of Arnor, the management of Minas Morgul, suggest a being who retained a significant degree of autonomous judgment and initiative within the framework of Sauron's strategic direction. Sauron pointed the Witch King at objectives, but the Witch King chose the methods. Sauron set the strategy, but the Witch King executed the tactics. The relationship was more like that between a chief executive and his most trusted general than like the relationship between a puppeteer and a puppet. There is also the question of the Witch King's emotions, whether the being who had been a man for millennia and a wraith for millennia more still felt anything resembling human emotion. The evidence suggests that he did, but in a distorted, corrupted form. The laughter, the terrible laughter at the gate of Minas Tirith, the contemptuous amusement when Owen challenged him, suggests a being who is capable of something like pleasure, but whose pleasure is inseparable from cruelty. The challenge to Arnor, the taunt, the dare, the deliberate exploitation of the king's pride, suggests a being who is capable of something like strategic delight, a cold satisfaction in the manipulation of an enemy's weakness. But these emotions, if they can be called emotions, are not human emotions. They are the residue of human emotions, filtered through 4,000 years of corruption and transformed into something that serves the Wraith's purposes rather than expressing the man's nature. The Witch King's laughter is not joy. It is the sound of a being who has forgotten what joy is, and who uses the mechanical form of laughter to express something that has no name. A cold, hollow satisfaction that is to real happiness what the wraith is to the real man, a shadow of a shadow, an echo of an echo. Part 30. The Witch King's psychology. This brings us to one of the most difficult and most fascinating questions about the Witch King. Did he suffer? Was there, somewhere inside the wraith, a remnant of the man, a consciousness that remembered being human, that remembered sunlight and warmth and the taste of food and the touch of another person's hand, that knew what had been lost and that grieved for it? Tolkien does not answer this question directly, but the implications of his cosmology suggest that the answer is yes, or at least that the man who became the Witch King experienced something far worse than simple oblivion. The rings of power extended the lives of their bearers, but they did so by stretching existence thinner and thinner, like butter scraped over too much bread, to borrow Bilbo's. The Nine Kings did not gain eternal youth. They gained eternal existence. Existence without substance. Existence without the physical reality that makes existence bearable. Existence as a consciousness suspended in a void, aware of the world but unable to participate in it, except through the will of Sauron and the terror of their presence. Imagine what this means. Imagine being alive, conscious, aware, thinking, but unable to touch anything, taste anything, smell anything, feel the warmth of sunlight or the coolness of water. Imagine existing for 4,000 years in this state. 4,000 years of sensory deprivation so complete that the concept of physical sensation becomes a distant memory. A story you once heard about a life you once lived that may or may not have been real. Imagine retaining just enough of your original consciousness to know what you have lost, to remember what it was like to be alive, to understand, with the terrible clarity of a mind that has had millennia to reflect, the full scope of the catastrophe that your ambition brought upon you. The Witch King's fury, the rage that drives him, the cold malice that he projects across battlefields, may be, at its root, the fury of a being who is in anguish. Not the anguish of physical pain, he has no body to feel pain, but the anguish of an existence that is fundamentally and irreversibly broken. An existence that will never again contain the simple, ordinary pleasures that define human life. The Witch King may hate the living, may hate them with the consuming, all-encompassing hatred that is his most characteristic quality, because the living have what he can never have again. They can feel. They can touch. They can taste. They can die. And the Witch King, who was tricked into surrendering all of these things in exchange for a power that consumed everything it touched, cannot. If this is true, if the Witch King suffers, if there is a remnant of the man inside the wraith that grieves for what was lost, then the Witch King is not just a villain. He is a tragedy. The tragedy of a man who wanted too much and received exactly what he asked for, only to discover that what he asked for was his own destruction, his own eternal imprisonment in a state that is worse than death, because death, at least, would be an ending. Part 31. The man he was. We do not know the Witch King's name, but we can imagine the kind of man he was, because the kind of wraith he became tells us something about the man who was consumed. He was ambitious. This much is certain. The rings of power appealed to ambition. They offered power, dominion, the ability to shape the world. A man without ambition would not have been attracted to the ring's offering. The Witch King was a man who wanted power, not necessarily evil power, not at first, but the power to do, to build, to command, to leave a mark on the world that would outlast his mortal lifespan. He was intelligent. The strategic sophistication of his campaigns, the political manipulation of Rudor, the patient attrition of Arnor, the psychological exploitation of Arnor, demonstrates a mind of extraordinary capability. The Witch King was not a brute. He was a thinker, a planner, a being who saw the long game and who had the patience and the discipline to play it across centuries. He was proud. The laughter, the terrible, contemptuous laughter, suggests a being whose pride has survived the wraithing, whose sense of superiority has endured across millennia of non-existence. The Witch King does not merely fight his enemies. He mocks them. He taunts them. He demonstrates, with the casual cruelty of a being who considers himself fundamentally superior, that their resistance is not just futile but amusing. The pride is the one human quality that the ring did not consume, perhaps because pride, unlike love or joy or compassion, is compatible with evil. Perhaps because pride is the quality that made the Witch King vulnerable to the ring in the first place, and the ring preserved it as a kind of trophied reminder of the man it had devoured. He was Menrian. This means he came from a society that valued craft, learning, exploration, and mastery. A society that built the greatest ships, the tallest towers, the most magnificent cities in the mortal world. The Witch King grew up in a civilization that believed in human potential, that celebrated human achievement, that viewed the limitations of mortality as challenges to be overcome, rather than boundaries to be accepted. This cultural background makes his fall more poignant and more understandable. The ring offered him the ultimate expression of the values he had been raised with. It offered him transcendence, It offered him mastery. It offered him the power to become more than mortal. And the values of his civilization, the values that had made Menor great, were the values that made him vulnerable to the ring's seduction. Part 32. The Witch King as a mirror. The Witch King serves a specific narrative function in The Lord of the Rings that goes beyond his role as a military antagonist. He is a mirror. A demonstration, a walking proof of what the ring does to mortal men. When Frodo looks at the Witch King, when he sees the wraith in the unseen world, the burning eyes, the crown above the emptiness where a face should be, he is looking at his own potential future. He is seeing what will happen to him if the ring is not destroyed. He is seeing the end state of the process that has already begun, the process that the Morgul blade accelerated, the process by which the ring consumes its bearer, erasing the person and leaving the wraith. The Witch King is Frodo's shadow. He is the version of Frodo that succeeds, that keeps the ring, that uses it, that lives forever in the terrible, hollow eternity that the ring provides. Every time Frodo feels the ring's pull, every time the ring whispers its promises of power and protection and transcendence, the Witch King is the answer to those promises. The power is real. The transcendence is real. And the cost is the Witch King, a being who was once a man and who is now nothing. A crown without a head, a cloak without a body, a voice without a mouth. This mirroring is essential to the emotional architecture of the story. Without the Witch King, the ring's threat is abstract, a vague warning about corruption and power. With the Witch King, the threat is concrete, a specific, visible, terrifying demonstration of what happens when a man says yes to the ring's offer. The Witch King makes the stakes real. He makes the danger tangible. He gives Frodo and the reader a visceral, unforgettable image of what the ring's power costs. And the mirroring extends to Aragorn as well. Aragorn is a Dunedain, a descendant of the Númenóreans, the same people who produced the Witch King. Aragorn carries the same heritage, the same blood, the same potential. The Witch King is what a Dunedain becomes when he accepts the ring's power. Aragorn is what a Dunedain becomes when he refuses it. They are the two possible outcomes of the same lineage, the two paths that diverge from the same starting point, and the choice between them is the choice that defines the story. Part 33. The Witch King and the Ring. There is a question that deserves attention. What was the Witch King's relationship with the One Ring during the War of the Ring? Did he want it for himself? Did he understand what it was? Did he feel its pull the way Frodo felt it, the way Boromir felt it, the way every mortal being who came near the ring felt its seductive, corrupting attraction? The answer is complex. The Witch King was bound to the One Ring through his own ring of power. The Nine were linked to the One, and the One's commands were transmitted through the Nine to their bearers. The Witch King could sense the One Ring. He could feel its presence. He was drawn to it, pulled toward it, oriented toward it the way a compass needle is oriented toward the magnetic pole. The ring sense was one of the Nazgûl's most important capabilities, the ability to detect the One Ring's presence across distance, to home in on it, to track it. But the Witch King did not want the ring for himself. He could not. The wraithing had consumed his ability to desire independently of Sauron's will. The Witch King's desires were Sauron's desires, filtered through the wraith, distorted by the corruption, but fundamentally aligned with the Dark Lord's purposes. The Witch King hunted the ring not because he wanted it, but because Sauron wanted it. And Sauron's want was the Witch King's want. And the distinction between master and servant had been erased by millennia of domination. This is the final cruelty of the Nine Rings. They did not merely enslave their bearers. They consumed their bearers' capacity for independent desire. The 9 kings who received the rings wanted power, personal power, individual power, the power to pursue their own ambitions and to shape the world according to their own vision. And the rings gave them power, but the power they gave was Sauron's power, and the ambitions they served were Sauron's ambitions. And the vision they pursued was Sauron's vision. The rings took men who wanted to be masters and turned them into servants. They took men who wanted to conquer the world and turned them into tools for someone else's conquest. The irony is absolute. The Witch King wanted power, and the ring gave him more power than any mortal had ever possessed. And the power was not his, and would never be his, and could never be his, because the price of the power was the self that would have wielded it. Consider what this means in practical terms. The Witch King fought battles, conducted sieges, destroyed kingdoms, broke kings, and none of it was for himself. Every victory was Sauron's victory. Every kingdom destroyed was destroyed for Sauron's benefit. Every act of terror, every deployment of force, every strategic calculation was performed in service of an agenda that was not the Witch King's own. The Witch King was the most effective military commander in the history of the Third Age, and he was fighting someone else's war. He was the most powerful mortal-born being in the world, and he was a servant. He was the conqueror of nations, and he was a slave. The rings did not merely enslave. They perfected the enslavement by making it invisible, by erasing the distinction between the slave's will and the master's will, by making the slave believe or be unable to determine that the master's desires were his own. The Witch King did not serve Sauron reluctantly, straining against his bonds, dreaming of freedom. He served Sauron seamlessly, because the bonds had become his nature, because the chains had been woven so deeply into his consciousness that he could no longer distinguish between obedience and choice. This is the ring's deepest evil, not that it enslaves, but that it makes slavery indistinguishable from freedom. Part 34. The Witch King and the Dunedain. There is a specific irony in the Witch King's story that deserves particular attention. His war against the Dunedain of the North, the Rangers, the remnants of the kingdom he destroyed, was, in a sense, a war against his own people, or at least against the descendants of his own people. The Witch King was almost certainly an Menrian, a member of the same race that produced the Dunedain, the same bloodline that flowed through the veins of Aragorn and Faramir and the Rangers of the North. The Dunedain were the Witch King's kin. The kingdom he destroyed was his people's kingdom. The line of kings he broke was his people's line. This gives the Witch King's campaign against Arnor an additional dimension of horror. It was not merely a war of conquest, it was a war of kinslaying, a destruction visited by a corrupted Menrian upon the legacy of his own people. The Witch King destroyed the northern Dunedain not as a foreign invader destroying an alien culture, but as a fallen son destroying his own family, a being who had been corrupted so thoroughly that he could annihilate his own heritage without hesitation, without regret, without any flicker of recognition that the people he was grinding into dust were the descendants of the civilization that had produced him. And the Dunedain knew it. They knew, or suspected, that the Lord of Angmar was a corrupted man. Perhaps a corrupted Menrian, perhaps one of their own fallen into shadow. They fought him with the specific hatred that is reserved for traitors, for those who betray their own kind, who turn against their own blood, who use their gifts and their heritage as weapons against the people who share those gifts. The barrow blades that the smiths of Cardolan forged were not ordinary weapons. They were crafted with the knowledge and the fury of a people fighting a war of survival against a being who should have been their champion but had become their destroyer. The Witch King's war against the Dunedain is a war of self-destruction. the destruction of his own people, his own culture, his own legacy. And the completeness of that destruction, the thoroughness with which he erased the northern kingdom, scattered the Nadain, broke the line of kings, tells us something about the depth of the corruption that the ring had worked upon him. There was nothing left of the man who had been a Númenórean. The heritage was gone. The identity was gone. The loyalty, the kinship, the connection to his own people, all of it had been consumed by the ring, replaced by the cold, hollow, purposeless malice that was the only thing the wraith had in common with the man. Part 35. 4,000 years. I keep returning to the time frame, because the time frame is the thing that is hardest to comprehend and that most defines the horror of the Witch King's existence. 4,000 years. The Witch King existed as a wraith for roughly 4,000 years, from the middle of the Second Age when the 9 rings were distributed, to the year 3019 of the Third Age, when Owen and Merry brought him down on the Pelennor Fields. 4,000 years. Think about what that means. The entirety of recorded human history, from the earliest civilizations of Mesopotamia to the present day, fits inside that span. The Witch King existed as a wraith for longer than the entire duration of human civilization as we know it. He watched empires rise and fall. He watched peoples migrate and settle and be displaced. He watched the world change around him while he remained the same cold, hollow, bodiless consciousness, the same burning malice, the same endless hunger for a life he could no longer live and a warmth he could no longer feel. And he was aware of every moment. This is what separates the Witch King's existence from mere duration. He was not sleeping. He was not unconscious. He was awake, aware, thinking, feeling, whatever degraded sense the word applies to a wraith, experiencing the passage of time with the relentless, unavoidable consciousness of a being who cannot die and cannot rest and cannot forget. The loneliness is almost unimaginable. The Witch King had no companions, not in any meaningful sense. The other Nazgûl were fellow wraiths, but wraiths do not have friendships. They do not have conversations. They do not share stories or memories or the kind of quiet companionship that makes existence bearable. The Witch King existed for 4,000 years without a single relationship, a single connection, a single moment of genuine warmth or tenderness or mutual recognition. He was alone, surrounded by servants and subordinates and enemies, but alone in the way that only a being who has lost everything can be alone. And this loneliness may be the key to understanding the Witch King's character. His cruelty, the mocking laughter, the taunting, the deliberate psychological torment of his enemies may be the expression of a being who has been alone for so long that he has forgotten how to relate to other beings except through domination and terror. The Witch King has no other mode of interaction. He cannot befriend, he cannot love, he cannot negotiate or cooperate or empathize. He can only dominate, only terrify, only destroy, because these are the only forms of interaction that a 4,000-year-old wraith has left. Part 36. The Witch King and Fear. Fear is the Witch King's signature. More than any other quality, more than his sorcery, more than his military prowess, more than his strategic intelligence, fear defines the Witch King's impact on the world. And understanding how the Witch King uses fear tells us something about the nature of evil in Tolkien's moral universe. The Witch King's terror is not metaphorical. It is not a dramatic exaggeration of normal fear. It is a supernatural force, a power that attacks the nervous system directly, bypassing rational thought, overriding conscious courage, reducing the bravest warriors to trembling, weeping, fleeing animals. The Witch King's terror is, in a real sense, a weapon as precise and as effective as a sword, targeted at the enemy's will rather than at the enemy's body. And the terror scales. The Witch King can modulate his fear aura, increasing or decreasing its intensity, focusing it on specific targets, spreading it across whole battalions. At Weathertop, the terror was focused. 5 Nazgûl against a small party, the dread concentrated on a handful of hobbits. At the Pelennor, the terror was broadcast. The Witch King flying overhead on his fell beast, screaming, spreading his aura across the entire battlefield, affecting thousands of defenders simultaneously. The mechanics of the Witch King's terror reveal something important about the nature of evil in Tolkien. Evil in Tolkien's world is not merely a moral category. It is a force, a spiritual force, with measurable effects on the physical world. The Witch King's terror is not the normal fear that a soldier feels in battle. It is a spiritual assault, an attack on the soul, conducted by a being whose soul has been consumed by evil and who projects that evil outward, contaminating everything he touches. This is why only certain beings can resist the Witch King's terror. Gandalf resists because he is a Maya, a spiritual being of the same order as Sauron, whose own spiritual nature provides a defense against the Witch King's spiritual assault. Aragorn resists because he is a Dinadan of exceptional will, whose lineage and whose destiny give him a spiritual resilience that ordinary men lack. Owen resists because her despair has made her indifferent to the Witch King's primary lever, the threat of death, and because her fury has replaced her fear with something equally powerful and far less manageable. But ordinary men cannot resist. They break. They flee. They are not cowards. They are victims of a supernatural attack that their spiritual defenses are not equipped to withstand. The Witch King's terror is not a test of courage. It is an assault that makes courage irrelevant, because it operates below the level of conscious choice, attacking the animal body rather than the rational mind. Part 37. The Witch King and Merry. Merry Brandybuck, the hobbit whose blade broke the Witch King's sorcery, deserves closer examination, because his role in the Witch King's death is more significant and more strange than it might appear at first glance. Merry was not a warrior. He was not trained for combat. He was not destined for greatness in the way that Aragorn was destined for the kingship, or Frodo was destined to carry the ring. Merry was an ordinary hobbit, curious, brave in the way that hobbits are brave, which is not the dramatic, sword-swinging bravery of the sagas, but the quiet, stubborn, refuse-to-give-up bravery of people who do not know they are being heroic, and entirely unprepared for the role that fate had assigned him. And yet Merry was the one who carried the blade of Cardolan. Merry was the one who had received the barrow blade from Tom Bombadil. Merry was the one who had ridden to the Pelennor behind Owen, hidden and overlooked, insignificant in the military calculus of the battle. And Merry was the one who struck the blow that made the Witch King's death possible. The chain of events that brought Merry to the Pelennor with the barrow blade is so improbable, so unlikely, so dependent on a series of coincidences and accidents and arbitrary choices that it strains the bounds of coincidence and begins to look like something else. Like providence. Like design. Like the working of a force that operates beyond the visible mechanisms of the world, arranging events, placing pieces, ensuring that the right weapon reaches the right hand at the right moment. Tom Bombadil rescued the hobbits from the Barrow Wight and gave them the ancient blades. This happened in the Shire, before the Fellowship, before the war, before anyone knew what was coming. The blade that would break the Witch King's sorcery was placed in Merry's hand by a being of mysterious purpose who lived in a valley in the Old Forest and who seemed to exist outside the normal categories of power and allegiance that defined the rest of the world. And Merry carried the blade for months, through Bree, through Rivendell, through the Fellowship, through the separation at Amon Hen, through the captivity by the Uruk-hai, through Fangorn and Isengard and Rohan, without knowing what it was, without knowing what it was for, without knowing that the blade in his belt was the specific weapon that could break the specific sorcery that protected the specific being who would, at a specific moment on a specific battlefield, need to be killed. The blade found its target. Across 2,000 years and 1,000 miles, the weapon forged by the Witch King's victims reached the Witch King. It travelled from the Barrow Downs to the Pelennor in a hobbit's belt, carried by a being too small to be noticed, too insignificant to be feared, too overlooked to be stopped. The Witch King never saw Merry. He never considered Merry. A hobbit was nothing, an irrelevance, an insect, a creature beneath the notice of the Lord of the Nazgûl. And the irrelevance killed him. The insect brought him down. The nothing wielded the weapon that unmade the something, and 4,000 years of accumulated malice ended with a hobbit's blade in the back of a wraith's knee. Part 38. The Witch King's Fell Beast. The Fell Beast, the great winged creature that the Witch King rode during the War of the Ring, deserves attention, because it tells us something about the Witch King's relationship with the physical world and the tools he used to interact with it. The Witch King had no body. He was invisible, a consciousness without form, a will without substance. To operate in the material world, he needed instruments, physical objects and creatures that he could control, and through which he could project his will. The Fell Beast was one such instrument, a great, bat-winged, featherless predator, ancient and terrible, bred or captured for war, that served as the Witch King's mount and his vehicle for projecting power across the battlefield. The relationship between the Witch King and the Fell Beast was not the relationship between a rider and a horse. It was the relationship between a will and a tool, a consciousness directing a creature, using it as an extension of itself, operating through it the way a craftsman operates through his instruments. The Fell Beast was the Witch King's body, the physical form through which he moved, through which he struck, through which he made his presence felt in the material world. And the Fell Beast was terrible. It was enormous, large enough to carry the wraith and its armor through the air, large enough to strike down horses and riders with its talons, large enough to cast a shadow over the battlefield that announced the Witch King's presence as clearly as any banner. It stank of corruption, a charnel house smell, the stench of death and decay that preceded the Witch King's arrival and lingered long after his departure. And it screamed, a piercing, brain-rattling shriek that amplified the Witch King's own terror aura, adding a layer of animal fear to the supernatural dread. The Fell Beast was killed by Owen. When the Witch King descended on Thodin, Owen struck the Fell Beast's neck, severing its head. The creature crashed to the ground, dead, and the Witch King rose from the wreckage, without his mount, without his vehicle, standing on the ground for the first time in the battle, stripped of the aerial advantage that the Fell Beast had provided. This moment, the Witch King standing on the ground, dismounted, facing a woman with a sword, is the moment when the Witch King was most vulnerable. He was accustomed to fighting from above, from the back of his mount, striking down at targets who could not reach him. On the ground, he was reduced to melee combat, to face-to-face confrontation with a being whose despair made her immune to his terror, and whose sword was aimed at his existence rather than at a military objective. The Fell Beast's death stripped the Witch King of his preferred mode of engagement and forced him into the kind of fight he was least prepared for. A personal, close-quarters confrontation with a being who could not be frightened and who had nothing to lose. The loss of the fell beast was the first step in the sequence that killed him. Part 39. The Witch King in the Unseen World. When Frodo put on the ring at Weathertop, he entered the unseen world, the spiritual realm, the dimension in which the wraiths existed, and he saw the Witch King as the Witch King truly was. And what he saw was one of the most important images in the entire Lord of the Rings, because it tells us what the Witch King had become in the world that he actually inhabited. In the visible world, the Witch King was an empty cloak, a black hood, a black robe, a pair of gauntlets, an iron crown, all arranged around a void. There was nothing inside the cloak. No face, no body, no physical form, just emptiness, shaped into the outline of a figure, moving and acting as if occupied by a being that was not there. In the unseen world, the Witch King was something else. Frodo saw a tall, pale figure, robed in grey beneath his black mantle, wearing a helm of silver with a crown upon it, a being of terrible power, with keen and merciless eyes that burned in a white, haggard face. The Witch King in the unseen world was not empty. He was present, fully, terrifyingly present. A being of spiritual substance and spiritual authority, radiating power and malice with a clarity and an intensity that the visible world could not convey. This dual existence, invisible in the material world, powerfully present in the spiritual world, is the essence of the Witch King's condition. He is a being who has crossed over from one realm to another, who has lost his connection to the physical world and gained a terrifying connection to the spiritual world, who is more real as a wraith than he ever was as a man, because the unseen world is where his power resides and where his nature is fully expressed. The image of the Witch King in the unseen world also tells us something about what the ring promises and what it delivers. The ring promises transcendence, the ability to become more than human, to rise above the limitations of mortality, to exist in a realm of pure power and pure will. And the ring delivers on this promise. The Witch King has transcended his mortality. He exists in a realm of pure power. He has become more than human. But the transcendence is a horror, not a triumph, because the realm of pure power is a realm without warmth, without love, without any of the qualities that make existence worth experiencing. The ring gives you exactly what it promises, and the giving is the worst thing that can happen to you. Part 40. The Witch King's victims. Over 4,000 years, the Witch King destroyed an incalculable number of lives, and cataloguing the scope of his destruction helps us understand the weight of evil that rested on his hollow shoulders. He destroyed Arnor. The Northern Kingdom, the Kingdom of Elendil, the guardian of the Northern lands, the heritage of the Nadain, was systematically dismantled across 6 centuries of war. The population was scattered, the cities were ruined, the culture was broken. The people who survived were reduced to wanderers, rangers, guardians without a kingdom, protectors without a home. The Witch King did not merely defeat Arnor, he erased it. He removed it from the map, from the memory, from the consciousness of the peoples of Middle-earth. When Frodo and the hobbits travel through the ruins of the Northern Kingdom, the crumbling watchtowers, the overgrown roads, the fallen stones of cities that no one remembers, they are walking through the Witch King's handiwork. Every ruin is his signature. He destroyed the line of Gondor's kings. Arnor, the last king, was lured to his death by the Witch King's challenge, and the throne of Gondor sat empty for 1,000 years. The consequences of this vacancy are incalculable. A millennium of diminished authority, of disputed succession, of political instability that weakened Gondor at the precise moment when it most needed strength. The Witch King did not merely kill a king. He decapitated a civilization, and the wound never healed. He sent the Barrow-wights to desecrate the graves of Cardolan. The dead of the Northern Kingdom, the kings and warriors and common folk who had fought and died defending their homeland against the Witch King's armies, were denied their rest. Their graves were infested with evil spirits, their bones were disturbed, their memory was corrupted. The Witch King's cruelty extended beyond the living to the dead. He pursued his enemies even into their graves, denying them the dignity of a peaceful rest, turning their final resting places into traps for the unwary. He created Minas Morgul. The Tower of the Moon, one of the most beautiful places in Gondor, a beacon of civilization and culture and the light of the Western world, was transformed into a place of horror. The Witch King took something beautiful and made it hideous, took something alive and made it dead, took something that represented the best of human achievement and turned it into a monument to corruption. Minas Morgul is the Witch King's self-portrait, a place that was once beautiful and is now terrible. A place that retains the form of its original beauty but has replaced its substance with decay. Part 41. Minas Morgul and the shadow it cast. The transformation of Minas Ithil into Minas Morgul is worth examining in more detail, because the Witch King's 1,000-year occupation of the fortress reveals the full scope of what his presence does to a place and to the land around it. When the Witch King took Minas Ithil, it was a city of beauty, built by the faithful Númenóreans who had come to Middle-earth with Isildur, designed to mirror and complement Minas Anor, Nata Minas Tirith, across the valley of the Anduin. The Tower of the Moon was named for the light it caught and reflected, the pale silver light of the moon shining from its white walls, beautiful and serene. It was a place of learning, of culture, of the arts that the Númenóreans brought with them from their drowned island. The Witch King did not merely occupy this city, he corrupted it. Over centuries of residence, his presence transformed the physical landscape. The walls darkened, the stone decayed, the gardens died. The streams ran with luminous filth. The tower itself began to glow, not with moonlight, but with a phosphorescent corpse light, a sickly greenish luminescence that was not illumination, but its parody. The light of Minas Morgul was the light of corruption, the glow of decay, the shimmer of things rotting, the false radiance of a beauty that had been murdered and replaced by its own decomposing ghost. The valley around the tower changed with it. The Morgul Vale became a place where nothing wholesome grew, where the flowers were pale and shapely but nauseating, where the air was thick with a sweetness that was not pleasant but sickening, where the water glowed with the same corpse light as the tower. The land itself had been infected by the Witch King's presence, as if the spiritual corruption that had consumed the man was now consuming the landscape, spreading outward from the tower like a disease, corrupting everything it touched. When Frodo and Sam passed through the Morgul Vale on their way to Cirith Ungol, they experienced this corruption firsthand, the overwhelming sense of dread, the physical nausea, the feeling that the land itself was hostile and aware. The Morgul Vale was not merely a dangerous place. It was a spiritually contaminated place, a zone of corruption where the normal rules of the natural world had been overwritten by the Witch King's malice, where the land served the Wraith's purposes rather than life's, where the very ground underfoot was an extension of the Witch King's will. The capture of Minas Ithil also gave Sauron the Pelennor, the seeing stone of the Tower of the Moon. This single object, falling into Sauron's hands as a consequence of the Witch King's siege, became one of the most strategically important assets of the War of the Ring. Through the captured Pelennor, Sauron was able to contact Saruman to corrupt Denethor, to conduct the psychological warfare campaign that nearly broke Gondor from within. The Pelennor was the prize that the Witch King's 2-year siege delivered, and the consequences of that delivery shaped every major event of the War of the Ring. The Witch King's capture of Minas Ithil was not just a military victory. It was a strategic enabling action, the operation that gave Sauron the tool he needed to conduct the intelligence and psychological warfare campaign that nearly won him the war. Without the Pelennor, there would have been no corruption of Saruman, no breaking of Denethor, no dawnless day of carefully curated despair. The Witch King's siege of Minas Ithil, conducted more than 1,000 years before the War of the Ring, set in motion the chain of events that brought the world to the brink of darkness. Part 42. The Witch King and Prophecy. The prophecy of Glorfindel, "Not by the hand of man will he fall," raises a philosophical question that cuts to the heart of Tolkien's understanding of fate, free will, and the nature of prophetic knowledge. Did the prophecy protect the Witch King, or did it merely predict his death? If the prophecy was protective, if it actively prevented men from killing the Witch King, then the Witch King's invulnerability was a feature of the world itself, a divine or cosmic guarantee that no man could end his existence. Under this reading, every battle the Witch King fought was predetermined. Men who faced him were fated to fail, and the outcome was decided before the first blow was struck. If the prophecy was predictive, if it merely described how events would unfold without actively causing them, then the Witch King's invulnerability to men was a consequence of his own power rather than a cosmic guarantee. Under this reading, no man killed the Witch King because no man was powerful enough to kill him, and the prophecy was simply a statement of this fact rather than a cause of it. Tolkien's cosmology suggests a middle ground. Prophecies in Middle-earth are not simple predictions. They are expressions of the music of the Arnor, the cosmic plan, the divine design, the pattern that underlies the history of the world. Glorfindel, as an elf lord of great spiritual power who had been to the Blessed Realm and back, could perceive this pattern more clearly than most beings. His prophecy was not a guess or a prediction. It was an observation of the way the pattern was unfolding, a reading of the cosmic design, accurate because the design was real and because Glorfindel had the spiritual sight to perceive it. Under this reading, the prophecy was both predictive and, in a sense, protective, because the cosmic design was real, and the design included the fact that the Witch King would not fall to a man. The protection was not a spell or an enchantment. It was a feature of the world's design, the way the story was meant to unfold, the pattern that the music of the Arnor had established at the beginning of time. And this means that the Witch King's death was also part of the pattern. Owen's presence on the Pelennor, Merry's blade, the chain of events that brought them together at the precise moment when the Witch King was vulnerable, all of this was part of the design. Not predetermined in a way that eliminated free will chose to ride to battle, Merry chose to follow her. Both chose to stand and fight when they could have fled, but woven into a pattern that was larger than any individual choice and that unfolded, at the moment of crisis, in the way that the cosmic design intended. Part 43. What the Witch King represents. The Witch King is not just a character. He is a thesis statement, a demonstration of a specific moral and philosophical idea that runs through the entire Lord of the Rings. The idea that the pursuit of power through domination leads inevitably to self-destruction. The Witch King wanted power. He received power. The power consumed him. This is not a coincidence or a bad luck or a failure of strategy. It is the inherent logic of the kind of power the ring offers, the power of domination, the power that comes from imposing your will on others, the power that makes you strong by making others weak. This kind of power is inherently self-defeating, because it destroys the self that wields it. The more you dominate, the more you become an instrument of domination. The more you impose your will, the more your will becomes an expression of the force that enables the imposition. The more power you accumulate, the less of you there is to use it, until there is nothing left, until the man is gone and the wraith remains, and the wraith has all the power and none of the person. The Witch King is the proof of this thesis. He is the demonstration, played out across 4,000 years, of what happens when the pursuit of power through domination is taken to its logical conclusion. He begins as a man, ambitious, talented, powerful. He ends as a wraith, empty, hollow, a tool of someone else's will, a weapon in someone else's hand. A being who has more power than any mortal in the history of the world, and who is, despite that power, fundamentally nothing. This thesis is Tolkien's answer to the temptation of the ring. The ring offers power, and the Witch King proves that the offer is real. But the Witch King also proves that the power is a trap, because the power destroys the person who wields it. The ring does not lie about what it offers. It lies about what it costs. And the Witch King is the cost, the living or embodiment of the price that the ring demands for its gifts. Part 44. The Witch King and Tolkien's War. Tolkien fought in the trenches of the Somme, and his experience of modern industrial warfare shaped his fiction in ways that are sometimes obvious and sometimes subtle. The Witch King, I believe, carries echoes of that experience, echoes that connect the fictional terror of the Ringwraith to the real terror of the Western Front. The Witch King's terror aura, the supernatural dread that breaks the will of soldiers, that sends trained warriors fleeing, that reduces brave men to trembling animals, has parallels in the psychological effects of modern warfare. The phenomenon that was called shell shock in Tolkien's era, and that we now recognize as post-traumatic stress, produced effects remarkably similar to the Witch King's terror. The overwhelming of the nervous system by an experience too intense and too threatening for the mind to process, resulting in a collapse of the will, a paralysis of the body, and a profound, lasting damage to the capacity for normal functioning. Tolkien knew men who had been broken by the terror of the trenches, men who had gone into the war brave and capable and had come out shattered, diminished, unable to function. He knew what it looked like when courage reached its limit and broke. And the Witch King's terror, I think, is Tolkien's way of giving that experience a form, of taking the formless, nameless, overwhelming dread of modern warfare and embodying it in a single terrible figure. The being who projects fear as a weapon, who breaks soldiers not through physical violence but through psychological assault, who destroys the will without touching the body. The Witch King is not a direct allegory of the Western Front. Tolkien hated allegory, but the Witch King carries the emotional truth of Tolkien's war experience, the truth that there are terrors that transcend the capacity of courage to withstand, that there are forces that break the bravest men, that there are experiences so extreme that they overwhelm the human nervous system and leave behind a hollowed-out person who is still alive, but no longer fully present. Part 45. The End of the Witch King's Story. The Witch King's story ends on the Pelennor Fields, but the end deserves to be considered not just as an event, but as a conclusion to a 4,000-year arc that is, in its way, one of the most complete and most devastating character arcs in all of fantasy literature. The Witch King began as a man. A Númenórean, a being of culture and intelligence and ambition, born into the greatest civilization of the mortal world, gifted with talents that made him exceptional even among the exceptional. He was somebody, a lord, a leader, a person with a name and a history and a future. He put on a ring, and the ring consumed him. Slowly, patiently, irrevocably, across centuries, across millennia. The ring ate the man and left the wraith. The name was gone. The body was gone. The capacity for joy, for love, for connection, for the simple ordinary pleasures that make life worth living, all of it was gone. What remained was power. Vast, terrible, millennia-old power. The power to terrify, to dominate, to destroy, to break kingdoms and crush armies and terrorize civilizations. And the power was not his. It belonged to Sauron. It always belonged to Sauron. The Witch King's 4,000 years of power were 4,000 years of servitude, 4,000 years of wielding someone else's weapon, pursuing someone else's goals, serving someone else's ambition. The man who wanted power had received it, and the receiving had destroyed him. And the destroyed thing had been used for 4,000 years as a tool in someone else's hand. And then a woman and a hobbit killed him. Not a great lord, not a mighty warrior, not one of the powers of the world. A woman who was forbidden to fight, and a hobbit who was too small to matter. The being who had destroyed kingdoms and broken kings and terrorized the world for longer than most civilizations had existed, this being was brought down by the overlooked and the forbidden, by the small and the excluded, by the very kinds of beings that his framework of power and domination and terror could not account for. The Witch King's death is the final proof of the thesis that his life embodies. The power of domination leads to the destruction of the dominator. The path of the ring leads to the emptiness of the wraith. And the emptiness is vulnerable, vulnerable to the things that the powerful overlook, to the small and the ordinary and the stubbornly, irrepressibly alive. Part 46. The Wraith and the Shield Maiden. Let me hold this moment, the final moment, the killing moment, and look at it one more time. Because the confrontation between the Witch King and Owen is not just the climax of the Witch King's story. It is one of the most important scenes in the entire Lord of the Rings, and it carries a weight of meaning that extends far beyond the military significance of a single combat. The Witch King is 4,000 years old. He has destroyed kingdoms, broken kings, terrorized civilizations. He has fought more battles than any other being in Middle-earth. He has survived every encounter, endured every challenge, overcome every opposition. He is, by any measure, the most experienced and the most dangerous warrior on the Pelennor Fields, a being whose combat record stretches across millennia, and whose confidence is the confidence of absolute certainty. He cannot be killed by any man. He knows this. The prophecy guarantees it. He is invincible. And he faces a woman who wants to die. This is the collision. The being who cannot die faces the being who does not fear death. The being whose power is terror faces the being who has nothing left to lose. The being who has conquered through fear for 4,000 years faces the one being on the entire battlefield who is, at this moment, genuinely fearless. Not through courage, though Owen is courageous, but through despair. Through a grief so deep and a hopelessness so consuming that death holds no terror for her, because life holds no value. The Witch King's system fails. His primary weapon, the terror that has broken soldiers and shattered armies for millennia, encounters a target it cannot affect. Owen does not break. She does not flee. She stands, and she fights, and she strikes. And the Witch King, for the first time in 4,000 years, faces an opponent who is immune to his most devastating capability. And in that moment, the moment when the terror fails, the moment when the invincible encounters the unflinching, the prophecy does its work. Not by the hand of man. The loophole opens. The cosmic design reveals itself. The pattern that was woven into the world at its creation unfolds at last, and the Witch King, the being who thought himself beyond the reach of mortality, discovers that he is not beyond the reach of anything. He is mortal. He is vulnerable. He is, at the last, killable. Not by the powerful, not by the great, not by the beings he spent 4,000 years preparing to face, but by the ones he never thought to guard against. The woman and the hobbit. The despair and the ancient blade. The overlooked and the forgotten. The crown rolls across the grass. The cloak collapses. The being that was once a man and that became the most terrible servant of the Dark Lord is unmade, dissolved, dispersed, released from the 4,000-year prison of his own corruption. And the field falls silent, and the wind blows through the empty cloak, and the Witch King of Angmar is gone. Part 47. The Witch King and the Other Fallen Beings. The Witch King's story gains additional depth when placed alongside the stories of the other great fallen beings in Tolkien's legendarium, because the comparison reveals what is unique about the Witch King's fall, and what it shares with the falls of others. Morgoth fell from the highest possible station, from the greatest of the Ainur, the most powerful being in creation outside of Ilúvatar himself, to the imprisoned, diminished, broken Dark Lord cast into the void at the end of the First Age. Morgoth's fall was a fall from divinity. It was cosmic in scale, apocalyptic in consequence, and driven by a corruption that predated the creation of the physical world. Sauron's fall was a fall from service, from Ol's workshop, where he had been a mire of craft and order, to the throne of Barad-dûrta, where he became the lord of domination and the enemy of all free will. Sauron's fall was driven by his desire to order the world, to impose his vision of perfection on a creation that he found chaotic and unfinished. He fell not from pride like Mor, but from a desire for control that metastasized into tyranny. Saruman's fall was a fall from wisdom, from the head of the Astari, the wisest of the wizards sent to aid the free peoples, to a broken, petty, diminished creature enslaving hobbits in the Shire. Saruman's fall was driven by his study of Sauron's methods, which he adopted first as a research methodology and then as a way of life. He fell by becoming the thing he was sent to oppose. The Witch King's fall is different from all of these. It is a fall from mortality, from the specific, bounded, finite existence of a human being to the specific, bounded, infinite non-existence of a wraith. The Witch King did not fall from divinity or from wisdom or from service. He fell from humanity. He lost not cosmic power or angelic status, but the simple, ordinary, specifically human qualities that make mortal life bearable: warmth, touch, taste, companionship, the ability to age, the ability to die. And this makes the Witch King's fall, in some ways, the most relatable of all the great falls. Morgoth's fall is cosmic. Most of us cannot identify with a being of divine power who rebels against the Creator. Sauron's fall is intellectual. Most of us do not grapple with the temptation to reorganize the entire world according to our personal vision of order. But the Witch King's fall is human. It is the fall of a man who wanted more than he was given, who reached for immortality and received it, and who discovered that immortality without the qualities that make life worth living is not a gift but a curse. The Witch King's fall is the fall of ambition, the specific, recognizable, universally human temptation to be more, to have more, to reach beyond the boundaries of your nature in pursuit of something that your nature cannot sustain. We all understand this temptation. We all feel, in some measure, the desire that drove the Witch King to accept the ring, the desire to transcend our limitations, to extend our reach, to become something more than what we are. And the Witch King's story tells us what happens when that desire is satisfied. You become more. And the more is empty, and the emptiness is forever. Part 48. The Witch King and the Barrow Wights. I want to return to the Barrow Wights because this aspect of the Witch King's activity is underappreciated and reveals a dimension of his character that goes beyond military strategy into something more personal and more disturbing. The Witch King sent evil spirits to inhabit the graves of the dead of Cardolan. This was not a military operation. It served no strategic purpose. The kingdom of Cardolan was already destroyed, its armies scattered, its people dispersed. There was no military reason to infest the tombs. The Barrow Wights were not sentries guarding a border or soldiers holding territory. They were instruments of desecration, spirits deployed specifically to corrupt the resting places of the dead, to defile the memory of the fallen, to deny peace to the defeated. This is cruelty beyond strategy. This is cruelty as expression. The Witch King imposing his malice on the world, not for any practical purpose, but because the imposition of malice is the only form of self-expression available to a being who has lost every other form. The Wraith cannot create. The Wraith cannot love. The Wraith cannot build or plant or nurture or make anything that did not exist before. The Wraith can only corrupt, can only take things that were good and make them bad, take things that were beautiful and make them ugly, take things that were at rest and disturb them. The Barrow Wights are the Witch King's art. They are the closest thing to creativity that a being of his nature can achieve, the transformation of something peaceful into something horrible, the reimagining of graves as traps, of tombs as prisons, of the resting places of the honored dead as sites of terror and entrapment. And the fact that the Witch King devoted effort and attention to this project, that he bothered to defile the graves of a kingdom that was already destroyed, tells us something about the inner life of the Wraith that goes beyond his role as Sauron's chief agent. The Witch King is not merely following orders, he is expressing something that has no name, something that exists below the level of conscious motivation, something that drives a being who has lost everything to corrupt the few things he can still reach. Call it malice. Call it nihilism. Call it the spiritual equivalent of a starving animal devouring whatever it can find, regardless of need or nutrition. The Witch King corrupts because corruption is the only activity available to a being who has been consumed by the very power he sought. He cannot build. So he breaks. He cannot create. So he destroys. He cannot live. So he denies life to others, even to the dead. Part 49. The Witch King and the Passage of Ages. The Witch King is one of the very few characters in Tolkien's legendarium who spans the boundary between the Second Age and the Third Age, who was present at the making of the Rings of Power and was still present at their unmade end. His existence bridges two eras of the world, and this bridging gives him a unique perspective on the story of Middle-earth. The Witch King saw the world of the Rings of Power from both sides. He was there when Sauron forged the One Ring, or at least he was present in the world when it was forged, already bearing his own ring, already beginning the long fade into wraithhood. He experienced the full cycle of the ring's influence on Middle-earth, the initial seduction, the gradual corruption, the wars, the defeat, the rebuilding, the return, and the final destruction. He is, in a sense, the through line of the Rings' story, the being whose existence demonstrates from beginning to end what the Rings were designed to do and what they actually accomplished. And the Witch King's existence across this span tells us something about the nature of evil in Tolkien's world. Evil endures. Evil is patient. Evil does not tire, does not age, does not lose its purpose or its motivation across the passage of centuries. The Witch King was as malicious in the year 3019 of the Third Age as he had been in the year of his wraithing, thousands of years earlier. His hatreds did not diminish. His cruelty did not soften. His capacity for destruction did not diminish with age. Time, which heals mortal wounds and softens mortal hatreds, had no power over the Witch King. He was beyond time's reach, fixed in his corruption, preserved in his malice, unchanging and unchangeable across the slow centuries of the world. This is the terror of the Wraith state. Not merely that it is eternal, but that it is static. Mortal beings change. They grow, they learn, they evolve, they are shaped by their experiences. The Witch King did not change. He was the same being in his last battle that he had been in his first, the same cold malice, the same terrible power, the same hollow emptiness. 4,000 years of existence, and not a single moment of growth, of reflection, of the kind of genuine change that makes mortal life meaningful. The Witch King is the argument against immortality. He is the demonstration that existence without change is not life, but imprisonment. That a being who cannot grow cannot truly live. And that the immortality the ring offered was not the immortality of the elves, who change and grow and are enriched by the passage of time, but the immortality of the stone, which endures but does not live, which persists but does not grow, which is unchanged by the centuries that pass over it. The contrast with the elves is instructive. The elves are immortal, they do not age, they do not die of natural causes, they endure across the ages of the world. But elven immortality is a living immortality. The elves change, they grow. They are shaped by their experiences. They accumulate wisdom and depth, and the rich patina of a consciousness that has been engaging with the world for millennia. Elven immortality is the immortality of the river, always flowing, always changing, always the same river, but never the same water. The Witch King's immortality is the opposite. It is the immortality of the ice, frozen, static, unchanging, preserving the form without the substance, maintaining the shape without the life. The Witch King endured for 4,000 years, and at the end of those 4,000 years, he was the same being he had been at the beginning, the same cold malice, the same calculating intelligence, the same hollow, purposeless cruelty. Time did not soften him. Experience did not teach him. The passage of centuries, which enriches the elves and transforms mortal men, did nothing to the Witch King except confirm him in his corruption. This contrast is Tolkien's deepest commentary on the difference between true immortality and the counterfeit immortality that the ring offers. True immortality, the immortality of the elves, the immortality that is a gift of Ilúvatar, is immortality with growth, with change, with the capacity for genuine experience. The ring's immortality is immortality without these things, an eternity of stasis, of emptiness, of the form of life without its substance. The Witch King lived forever, and the forever was a prison. Part 50. The Witch King and Women. There is a gender dimension to the Witch King's story that deserves careful attention, because the prophecy that defines his fate and the woman who fulfills it are part of a larger pattern in Tolkien's work that speaks to the relationship between power, gender, and the categories through which the powerful understand the world. Not by the hand of man will he fall. The prophecy excludes men, specifically the male warriors who compose the armies and fight the battles and defend the kingdoms of Middle-earth. The prophecy's exclusion is simultaneously a protection for the Witch King, who is safe from men, and a vulnerability because the exclusion creates a gap through which a non-man can strike. The prophecy protects against the expected and exposes to the unexpected. And the Witch King's response to the prophecy reveals the limits of his understanding. He interpreted not by the hand of man as by no hand at all. He assumed that his safety from men meant safety from everyone. because in his framework, men were the only beings who mattered on a battlefield. Women did not fight. Hobbits did not exist in his strategic calculus. The categories through which the Witch King understood the world did not include women warriors or halfling soldiers, and so the prophecy's exclusion of men seemed, to him, equivalent to an exclusion of all possible threats. This is the same error that Sauron makes with the hobbits, the same error of categorization, the same failure to imagine that beings outside your framework of power could be significant. The Witch King could not conceive of a woman challenging him in combat, because his 4,000-year experience of warfare was a 4,000-year experience of fighting men. Women were not soldiers. Women were not warriors. Women were not threats. And because the Witch King could not imagine a female warrior, he could not defend against one. Owen exploded this framework. Her challenge, "But no living man am I," is not merely a statement of fact. It is the shattering of a category, the breaking of a mental framework. The moment when the Witch King discovers that his understanding of the world is incomplete. The woman who should not be on the battlefield, who was forbidden to ride, who had to disguise herself as a man, who existed outside every category that the Witch King's world recognized, is the woman who kills him. The pattern is Tolkien's. The powerless overcome the powerful, the small overcome the great, the excluded overcome the included. Owen's victory over the Witch King is the victory of a being who existed outside the framework of power, outside the male-dominated military hierarchy, outside the categories of warriors and kings and heroes that the Witch King had spent 4,000 years mastering. She was invisible to him in the way that hobbits were invisible to Sauron, not because she was hidden, but because the framework through which the Witch King understood the world had no category for her. Part 51. The Name That Was Eaten. We began with the name, and we should end with the name, because the absence of the Witch King's name is the most eloquent detail in his entire story. He had a name. Once, a long time ago. A name given to him by parents who loved him, in a house on a sunlit island, in the greatest civilization of men that the world had ever seen. A name that meant something, that carried the weight of a lineage, the promise of a future. The identity of a specific, individual, irreplaceable human being. And the name is gone. Not forgotten. Forgotten implies that someone once remembered and then stopped. The name was consumed, devoured, eaten by the ring, dissolved by the corruption, unmade by the same force that unmade the man and left the wraith. The name did not survive because the person did not survive. A wraith has no name because a wraith has no identity. The Witch King is a title, not a name. A function, not a person. A description of what the wraith does, not a designation of who the wraith is. Because the wraith is not anyone. The wraith is nothing. The wraith is the absence of the someone who used to be there. Tolkien's decision not to name the Witch King is one of the great artistic choices in The Lord of the Rings. A name would have made the Witch King a person, a being with a past, a history, a specific identity that the reader could connect to and perhaps sympathize with. The absence of a name makes the Witch King a lesson, a demonstration, a warning, a proof of concept. We do not know the Witch King's name because knowing the name would make him human. And the whole point of the Witch King is that he is no longer human. The absence of the name is the absence of the man. And the absence of the man is the ring's triumph. Every other detail of the Witch King's story, the kingdom of Angmar, the destruction of Arnor, the capture of Minas Ithil, the hunt for the ring, the siege of Minas Tirith, the confrontation with Gandalf, the death on the Pelennor, every event, every action, every consequence flows from this single foundational catastrophe, A man put on a ring, and the ring ate his name, and the nameless thing that remained spent 4,000 years destroying the world, because destruction was the only thing it had left to do. Part 52. The Lesson of the Witch King. The Witch King's story is, at its heart, a cautionary tale, the most sustained, the most detailed, and the most devastating cautionary tale in all of Tolkien's work. And the caution is this: do not reach for the power that promises to make you more than you are, because the reaching will make you less. The Witch King reached. He was a Númenórean, a man of the most gifted, the most advanced, the most capable race of mortals in the history of the world. He was already more than most men could dream of being. And it was not enough. He wanted more. He wanted power beyond the mortal, life beyond the natural, reach beyond the human. And Sauron, who understood this desire, who had been exploiting this desire since the beginning of his war against the Free Peoples, offered him a ring. And the ring delivered. The power was real. The extended life was real. The enhanced ability, the deepened perception, the expanded awareness, all of it was real. The ring did not lie about what it offered. It offered exactly what it promised. And the Witch King accepted, and the accepting destroyed him, and the destruction was not a punishment, but a consequence. The natural, inevitable, unavoidable consequence of reaching for a power that consumes the one who grasps it. 4,000 years. 4,000 years of emptiness and servitude and terror and power and malice and loneliness and the slow, grinding, relentless awareness of everything that has been lost and will never be recovered. 4,000 years of being the most powerful mortal-born being in the history of the world and having nothing, no warmth, no love, no companionship, no taste, no touch, no rest, no peace, no end. 4,000 years of being everything and having nothing. And then the blade. And then the sword. And then the scream. And the collapse. And the empty cloak. And the crown rolling in the grass. And the wind blowing through the emptiness where a man used to be. The Witch King's story is the ring's story, told through the body and the absence of a body of a single human being. It is the story of what the ring does, shown rather than told, demonstrated across millennia of corrupted existence. The ring promises transcendence, and the Witch King is the transcendence, a being who has risen above mortality and found, on the other side, nothing. A being who has received everything the ring promised and discovered that everything the ring promises is the opposite of everything worth having. Part 53. The crown in the grass. Let me close with an image. The final image. The image that says everything that needs to be said about the Witch King of Angmar, the Lord of the Nazgûl, the fallen in Númenórean who became the greatest Ringwraith. After Owen struck the killing blow, after the Witch King screamed his last scream and the sorcery that bound him unravelled and the wraith was dispersed into the air, what remained on the ground was simple and terrible. A cloak, a set of armour, a pair of gauntlets, and a crown. The crown was iron. It was old, older than any kingdom of the Third Age, older than the memory of any living being, older than the ruins of the civilizations the Witch King had destroyed. It was the Witch King's crown, the symbol of his authority, the mark of his kingship, the emblem of the power he had wielded and the terror he had projected across 4,000 years of Middle-earth's history. And it was lying in the grass. On the Pelennor Fields, among the dead and the dying, among the broken spears and the trampled banners and the ruined bodies of men and orcs and horses. The crown of the Witch King, the crown of the being who had destroyed kingdoms and broken kings and terrorized civilizations and endured for longer than most civilizations had existed, was lying in the grass like any other piece of discarded metal. Ignored, unremarkable, indistinguishable from the debris of a battle that had already moved on. The crown in the grass is the final comment on the Witch King's existence. After 4,000 years of power and terror and domination, after the destruction of Arnor and the breaking of Gondor's kings, and the siege of Minas Tirith, and all the uncountable acts of cruelty and malice that filled the millennia of the Witch King's existence, what remains is a piece of iron in a field. Not a monument. Not a legacy. Not a name to be remembered, or a story to be told, or a mark on the world that endures beyond the being who made it. Just metal. Just grass. Just the wind, blowing over a field where terrible things happened, and where a crown lies empty, and a cloak lies flat, and a being who was once a man is finally, after 4,000 years, nothing. The Witch King of Angmar is gone. The name he lost will never be recovered. The man he was will never be remembered. The wraith he became will be remembered only as a terror, a shadow, a darkness on the edge of history. And the crown, the iron crown of Angmar and Morgul, the crown of the Lord of the Nazgûl, the crown that sat upon the emptiness where a face should have been, the crown lies in the grass, and the grass grows around it, and the wind blows, and time does what time always does to the things that the powerful leave behind. Thank you for spending this evening with me. The Witch King was the greatest of the Ringwraiths. He is also, I think, the saddest, because he was the one who lost the most, and who never knew what he had lost until it was far too late to reclaim it. Until next time.